Gulliver's Travels by Jonathan Swift. Read by Ted Denson. A note from the publisher. The author of these travels, Mr. Lemuel Gulliver, is my ancient and intimate friend. About 3 years ago, Mr. Gulliver, growing weary of the concourse of curious people coming to him at his house in Redriff, England, made a small purchase of land with a convenient house in Nottinghamshire, his native country, where he now lives retired, yet in good esteem among his neighbours. Before he quitted Redriff, he left in my hands the story of his travels, to dispose of it as I should think fit. There is an air of truth apparent through the whole, and indeed the author was so distinguished for his veracity that it became a sort of proverb among his neighbours at Redriff, when anyone affirmed a thing, to say it was as true as if Mr. Gulliver had spoke it. I now venture to send Lemuel Gulliver's story into the world, hoping it may be, at least for some time, a better entertainment to our young noblemen than the common scribbles of politics and party. Signed, Richard Simpson, Publisher, London, 1726.
In Nottinghamshire, England. I was the third of 5 sons. He sent me to Emmanuel College in Cambridge at 14 years old, where I resided 3 years and applied myself close to my studies. For the charge of maintaining me being too great for a narrow fortune, I was bound apprentice to Mr. James Bates, an eminent surgeon in London, with whom I continued 4 years. And my father now and then sending me small sums of money, I laid them out in learning navigation and other parts of the mathematics, useful to those who intend to travel, as I always believed it would be some time or other my fortune to do. When I left Mr. Bates, I went down to my father, where by the assistance of him and my Uncle John, I got £40 and a promise of £30 a year to maintain me at Leyden. There I studied physic 2 years and 7 months, knowing it would be useful in long voyages. Soon after my return from Leyden, I was recommended by Mr. Bates to be a surgeon to the Swallow, Captain Abraham Pennell, commander, with whom I continued 3 years and a half, making a voyage of 2 into the Levant and some other parts. When I came back, I resolved to settle in London, to which Mr. Bates encouraged me, and by him I was recommended to several patients. I took part of a small house in the Old Jury, and being advised to alter my condition, I married Mary Burton, second daughter to Mr. Edmund Burton, hosier in Newgate Street, with whom I received £400 for a portion. But my good Master Bates dying in 2 years after, and I having few friends, my business began to fail, for my conscience would not suffer me to imitate the bad practice of too many among my brethren. Having therefore consulted with my wife, I determined to go again to sea. I was surgeon successfully in 2 ships, and made several voyages for 6 years to the East and West Indies, by which I got some addition to my fortune. My hours of leisure I spent in reading the best authors, and when I was ashore in observing the manners and dispositions of the people, as well as learning their language, wherein I had a great facility. The last of these voyages not proving very fortunate, I grew weary of the sea and intended to stay home with my wife and family. I removed from the Old Jury to Wapping, hoping to get business among the sailors, but it would not turn to account. After 3 years' expectations that things would mend, I accepted an advantageous offer from Captain William Pritchard, master of the Antelope, who was making a voyage to the South Sea. We set sail from Bristol, May 4th, 1699, and our voyage, at first, was very prosperous. But in our passage to the East Indies, we were driven by a violent storm to the northwest of Van Diemen's Land. 12 of our crew were dead by immoderate labor and ill food. The rest were in a very weak condition. On the 5th of November, which was the beginning of summer in those parts, the weather being very hazy, the seamen spied a rock within a half a cable's length of the ship. But the wind was so strong that we were driven directly upon it, and immediately split. 6 of the crew, of whom I was one, having let down the boat into the sea, made a shift to get clear of the ship and the rock. We rowed, by my computation, about 3 leagues, till we were able to work no longer, being already spent with labor while we were in the ship. We therefore trusted ourselves to the mercy of the waves, and in about half an hour the boat was overset by a sudden flurry from the north. What became of my companions in the boat, as well as of those who escaped on the rock or were left in the vessel, I cannot tell, but conclude they were all lost. For my own part, I swam as fortune directed me, and was pushed forward by wind and tide. I often let my legs drop and could feel no bottom. But when I was almost gone and able to struggle no longer, I found myself within my depth, and by this time the storm was much abated. The declivity was so small that I walked near a mile before I got to the shore, which I conjectured was about 8 o'clock in the evening. I then advanced forward near half a mile, but could not discover any sign of houses or inhabitants. I was extremely tired, and found myself much inclined to sleep. I lay down on the grass, where I slept sounder than I ever remember to have done in my life, and as I reckon, above 9 hours. When I awaked, it was just daylight. I attempted to rise, but was not able to stir. For as I happened to lie on my back, I found my arms and legs were strongly fastened on each side to the ground, and my hair, which was long and thick, tied down in the same manner. I felt several slender ligatures across my body, from my armpits to my thighs. I could only look upwards. The sun began to grow hot, and the light offended my eyes. I heard a confused noise about me, and in a little time I felt something alive moving on my left leg, which, advancing gently forward over my breast, came almost up to my chin. Bending my eyes downwards as much as I could, I perceived it to be a human creature not 6 inches high, with a bow and arrow in its hands and a quiver at its back. In the meantime I felt at least 40 more of the same kind. I was in the utmost astonishment, and roared so loud they all ran back in affright, and some of them, as I was afterwards told, were hurt with the falls they got by leaping from my sides upon the ground. However, they soon returned, and one of them lifted up his hands and eyes by way of admiration, and cried out in a shrill but distinct voice, "Hecana Deagle!" The others repeated the same words several times, but I then knew not what they meant. I lay all this while in great uneasiness. At length, struggling to get loose, I had the fortune to break the strings and wrench out the pegs that fastened my left arm to the ground with a violent pull, which gave me excessive pain. I a little loosened the strings that tied down my hair on the left side, so that I was just able to turn my head about 2 inches, but the creatures ran off a second time before I could seize them. I heard one of them cry aloud, "Tolgo Phonak." Then in an instant I felt above 100 arrows discharged on my left hand, which pricked me like so many needles, and besides they shot another flight into the air, whereof many fell on my body, and some on my face, which I immediately covered with my left hand. When this shower of arrows was over, I fell groaning with grief and pain, and then striving again to get loose, they discharged another volley larger than the first, and some of them attempted with spears to stick me in the sides. I thought it the most prudent method to lie still, and my design was to continue so till night, when my left hand being already loose, I could easily free myself. When the people observed I was quiet, they discharged no more arrows. But by the noise I heard, I knew their numbers increased, and about 4 yards from me I heard a knocking for above an hour, like that of people at work. When turning my head that way, as well as the pegs and strings would permit me, I saw a stage erected about 1.5 feet from the ground, capable of holding 4 of the inhabitants, with 2 or 3 ladders to mount it. One of the inhabitants made me a long speech, whereof I understood not one syllable. But before the principal person began his oration, he cried out 3 times, "Langro Dihul San," whereupon immediately about 50 of the inhabitants came and cut the strings that fastened the left side of my head, which gave me the liberty of turning it to the right, and of observing the person that was to speak. He appeared to be of a middle age, and taller than any of the other 3 who attended him, whereof one was a page that held up his train and seemed to be somewhat longer than my middle finger. The other 2 stood, one on each side, to support him. He acted every part of an orator. and I could observe many periods of threatenings and others of promises, pity, and kindness. Being almost famished with hunger, I could not forbear showing my impatience by putting my finger frequently to my mouth, to signify that I wanted food. The Hergo, for so they call a great lord, as I afterwards learned, understood me very well. He descended from the stage and commanded that several ladders should be applied to my sides, on which above 100 of the inhabitants mounted and walked towards my mouth, laden with baskets full of meat. I observed that there was the flesh of several animals, but could not distinguish them by the taste. There were shoulders, legs, and loins shaped like those of mutton, and very well dressed, but smaller than the wings of a lark. I ate them by 2 or 3 at a mouthful, and took 3 loaves at a time, about the bigness of musket bullets. They supplied me as they could, showing 1,000 marks of wonder and astonishment at my bulk and appetite. I then made another sign that I wanted drink. They found by my eating that a small quantity would not suffice me, and being a most ingenious people, they slung up with great dexterity one of their largest hogsheads, then rolled it toward my hand, and beat out the top. I drank it off at a draught, which I might well do, for it did not hold half a pint, and tasted like a small wine of Burgundy, but much more delicious. They brought me a second hogshead, which I drank in the same manner, and made signs for more, but they had none to give me. When I had performed these wonders, they shouted for joy, and danced upon my breast, repeating several times, as they did at first, Hecana Digo. They made me a sign that I should throw down the 2 hogsheads, but first warning the people below to stand out of the way, crying aloud, Borach Mivila. And when they saw the vessels in the air, there was a universal shout of Hecana Digo. I confess I was often tempted, while they were passing backwards and forwards on my body, to seize 40 or 50 of the first that came in my reach and dash them against the ground. But I now considered myself bound by the laws of hospitality to a people who had treated me with so much expense and magnificence. After some time there appeared before me a person of high ranks from His Imperial Majesty. His Excellency, having mounted on the small of my right leg, advanced forwards up to my face with about a dozen of his retinue, and spoke 10 minutes without any signs of anger, often pointing forwards, which I afterwards found was towards the capital city, about a half a mile distance, whither it was agreed by His Majesty and Council that I must be conveyed. I answered in a few words, but to no purpose, and made a sign that I desired my liberty. It appeared that he understood me well enough, for he shook his head by way of disapprobation. However, he made other signs to let me understand that I should have meat and drink enough, and very good treatment. Upon this the Hergo and his train withdrew with much civility and cheerful countenances. Soon after I felt great numbers of the people on my left side relaxing the cords to such a degree that I was able to turn upon my right and to ease myself with making water, which I very plentifully did, to the great astonishment of the people, who, conjecturing by my motions what I was going to do, immediately opened to the right and left on that side, to avoid the torrent which fell with much noise and violence from me. But before this they had daubed my face and both my hands with a sort of ointment very pleasant to the smell, which in a few minutes removed all the smart of their arrows. These circumstances, added to the refreshment I had received by their victuals and drink, diagnosed me to sleep. I slept about 8 hours, as I was afterwards assured, and it was no wonder, for the physicians, by the Emperor's order, had mingled a sleepy potion in the hogsheads of wine. It seems that upon the first moment I was discovered sleeping on the ground after my landing, the Emperor had early notice of it by an express, and determined in council that I should be tied in the manner I have related, that plenty of meat and drink should be sent me, and a machine prepared to carry me to the capital city. 500 carpenters and engineers were immediately set at work to prepare the greatest engine they had. It was a frame of wood raised 3 inches from the ground, about 7 foot long and 4 wide, moving upon 22 wheels. It was brought parallel to me as I lay, but the principal difficulty was to raise and place me in the vehicle. 80 poles, each of 1 foot high, were erected for this purpose, and very strong cords were fastened by hooks to many bandages, which the workmen had girt around my neck, my hands, my body, and my legs. 900 of the strongest men were employed to draw up these cords by many pulleys fastened on the poles, and thus, in less than 3 hours, I was raised and slung into the engine, and there tied fast. While the whole operation was performing, I lay in a profound sleep by the face of that soporiferous medicine infused into my liquor. 1,500 of the emperor's largest horses, each about 4.5 inches high, were employed to draw me toward the metropolis. I awakened about 4 hours after we began our journey. We made a long march the remaining part of that day, and rested at night with 500 guards on each side of me, half with torches and half with bows and arrows. The next morning at sunrise we continued our march, and arrived within 200 yards of the city gates about noon. The emperor and all his court came out to meet us. At the place where the carriage stopped, there stood an ancient temple, the largest in the whole kingdom, which, having been polluted some years before by a murder, was looked upon as profane, and all the ornaments and furniture had been carried away. In this edifice it was determined I should lodge. It was reckoned that above 100,000 inhabitants came out of the town and mounted upon my body by the help of ladders. But a proclamation was soon issued to forbid it upon pain of death. When the workmen found it was impossible for me to break loose, they cut all the strings that bound me, whereupon I rose up with as melancholy a disposition as I have ever had in my life. But the noise and the astonishment of the people at seeing me rise and walk are not to be expressed. The chains that held my left leg were about 2 yards long and fixed within 4 inches of the gate. They allowed me to creep in and lie at my full length in the temple. When I arose the following morning, I creeped out of my lodging for some air, and the emperor was advancing on horseback towards me. When he alighted, he surveyed me round with great admiration, but kept without the length of my chain. He ordered his cooks and butlers to give me victuals and drink, which they pushed forward in a sort of vehicles upon wheels till I could reach them. I took these vehicles and soon emptied them all. 20 of them were filled with meat and 10 with liquor. For the better convenience of beholding the emperor, I lay on my side so that my face was parallel to his, and he stood but 3 yards off. I have since had him many times in my hand, and therefore cannot be deceived in the description. His dress was very plain and simple, and the fashion of it between the Asiatic and the European. But he had on his head a light helmet of gold adorned with jewels, and a plume on the crest. He held his sword drawn in his hand to defend himself if I should happen to break loose. It was almost 3 inches long. A large number of his ladies and courtiers arrived on the scene. They were all most magnificently clad in garments embroidered with figures of gold and silver. His Imperial Majesty spoke often to me, and I returned answers, but neither of us could understand a syllable. There were several of his priests and lawyers present, as I conjectured by their habits, who were commanded to address themselves to me, and I spoke to them in as many languages as I had the least smattering of, which were high and low, Dutch, Latin, French, Spanish, Italian, and lingua franca, but all to no purpose. After about 2 hours the court retired, and I was left with a strong guard to prevent the impertinence and probably malice of the rabble, who were very impatient to crowd about me as near as they durst, and some of them had the impudence to shoot their arrows at me. But the colonel ordered 6 of the ringleaders to be seized, and thought no punishment so proper as to deliver them bound into my hands, which some of his soldiers accordingly did. I took them all into my right hand, put 5 of them into my coat pocket, and as to the 6th, I made a countenance as if I would eat him alive. The poor man squalled terribly, and the colonel and his officers were in much pain, especially when they saw me take out my penknife. But I soon set him gently on the ground, and away he ran. I treated the rest in the same manner, taking them one by one out of my pocket, and I observed both the soldiers and the people were highly obliged at this mark of my clemency, which was represented very much to my advantage at court. Towards night I got with some difficulty into my house, where I lay on the ground, and continued to do so about a fortnight, during which time the emperor gave orders to have a bed prepared for me. 600 beds of the common measure were brought in carriages and worked up in my house. As the news of my arrival spread through the kingdom, it brought prodigious numbers of rich, idle, and curious people to see me. In the meantime, the emperor held frequent councils to debate what course should be taken with me. The court was under many difficulties concerning me. They apprehended my breaking loose, that my diet would be very expensive and might cause a famine. Sometimes they determined to starve me, or at least to shoot me in the face and hands with poisoned arrows, which would soon dispatch me. But they considered that the stench of so large a carcass might produce a plague in the metropolis. In the midst of these consultations, several officers of the army went to the door of the great council chamber and gave an account of my behavior, which made so favorable an impression in the breast of His Majesty and the whole board in my behalf, that an imperial commission was promptly issued. It obliged all the villages 900 yards around the city to deliver in every morning 6 beeves, 40 sheep, and other victuals for my sustenance, together with a proportionate quantity of bread and wine and other liquors. An establishment was also made of 600 persons to be my domestics, and tents built for them very conveniently on each side of my door. It was likewise ordered that 300 tailors should make me a suit of clothes after the fashion of the country, that 6 of His Majesty's great scholars should be employed to instruct me in their language, and lastly, that the emperor's horses and those of the nobility and troops of guards should be frequently exercised in my sight to accustom themselves to me. All these orders were duly put in execution, and in about 3 weeks I made a great progress in learning their language, during which time the emperor frequently honored me with his visits, and was pleased to assist my masters in teaching me. We began already to converse together in some sort, and the first words I learnt were to express my desire that he would please give me my liberty, which I every day repeated on my knees. His answer, as I could apprehend it, was that this must be a work of time, not to be thought on without the advice of his council, and that first I must swear a peace with him and his kingdom. However, that I should be used with all kindness, and he advised me to acquire, by my patience and discreet behavior, the good opinion of himself and his subjects. I was informed that by the laws of the kingdom I must be searched by 2 of his officers, and that whatever they took from me should be returned when I left the country. I took up the 2 officers in my hands, and put them first into my coat pockets, and then into every other pocket about me, except my 2 fobs, and another secret pocket wherein I had some little necessaries that were of no consequence to any but myself. In one of my fobs there was a silver watch, and in the other a small quantity of gold in a purse. These gentlemen, having pen, ink, and paper about them, made an exact inventory of everything they saw, and when they had done, desired I would set them down, that they might deliver it to the emperor. When this inventory was read over to the emperor, he directed me, although in very gentle terms, to deliver up the several particulars. He first called for my scimitar, which I took out, scabbard and all. He then desired me to draw it. I did so, and immediately all the troops gave a shout between terror and surprise, for the sun shone clear, and the reflection dazzled their eyes as I waved the scimitar to and fro in my hand. His Majesty ordered me to return it into the scabbard, and cast it on the ground as gently as I could. The next thing he demanded was one of the hollow iron pillars, by which he meant my pocket pistols. I drew it out, and at his desire, as well as I could, expressed to him the use of it, and charging it only with powder, I first cautioned the emperor not to be afraid, and then I let it off in the air. The astonishment here was much greater than at the sight of my scimitar. Hundreds fell down as if they had been struck dead, and even the emperor, although he stood his ground, could not recover himself in some time. I delivered up both my pistols and then my pouch of powder and bullets. I likewise delivered up my watch, which the emperor was very curious to see, and commanded two of his tallest yeomen of the guards to bear it on a pole upon their shoulders. He was amazed at the continual noise it made, and the motion of the minute hand. I then gave up my silver and copper money, my purse with 9 large pieces of gold, and some smaller ones, my knife, razor, comb, and silver snuff-box, my handkerchief and journal book. My scimitar, pistols, and pouch were conveyed in carriages to His Majesty's stores, but the rest of my goods were returned to me. I had, as I before observed, one private pocket which escaped their search, wherein there was a pair of spectacles, a pocket perspective, and several other little conveniences. My gentleness and good behavior had gained so far on the emperor and his court, and indeed upon the army and people in general, that I began to conceive hopes of getting my liberty in a short time. I took all possible methods to cultivate this favorable disposition. The natives came by degrees to be less apprehensive of any danger from me. I would sometimes lie down and let 5 or 6 of them dance on my hand, and at last the boys and girls would venture to come and play at hide-and-seek in my hair. I had now made a good progress in understanding and speaking their language. The emperor had a mind one day to entertain me with several of their country shows, wherein they exceed all nations I have known, both for dexterity and magnificence. I was diverted with none so much as that of the rope dances, performed upon a slender white thread, extended about 2 foot and 12 inches from the ground. There is likewise another diversion, which is only shown upon particular occasions. The emperor lays on the table 3 fine silken threads of 6 inches long. One is blue, the other red, and the third green. The emperor holds a stick in his hands, both ends parallel to the horizon, while the candidates, advancing one by one, sometimes leap over the stick, sometimes creep under it backwards and forwards several times, according as the stick is advanced or depressed. Whoever performs his part with the most agility, and holds out the longest in leaping and creeping, is rewarded with the blue-colored silk. The red is given to the next, and the green to the third, which they all wear girt twice round about the middle, and you see few great persons about this court who are not adorned with one of these girdles. 2 days after this entertainment, the emperor, having ordered that part of his army which quarters in and about his metropolis to be in readiness, desired I would stand like a colossus, with my legs apart as far as I conveniently could. He then commanded his general to draw up the troops in close order, and march them under me, with drums beating, colors flying, and pikes advanced. This body consisted of 3,000 foot and 1,000 horse. I had sent so many memorials and petitions for my liberty that His Majesty at length mentioned the matter, first in the cabinet, and then in a full council, where it was opposed by none. Articles and conditions upon which I should be set free were brought to me. After they were read, I was demanded to swear to the performance of them, first in the manner of my own country, and afterwards in the method prescribed by their laws, which was to hold my right foot in my left hand, to place the middle finger of my right hand on the crown of my head, and my thumb on the tip of my right ear. The articles and conditions read as follows. First, the Man Mountain shall not depart from our dominions without our license under our great seal. Second, he shall not presume to come into our metropolis without our express order, at which time the inhabitants shall have 2 hours' warning to keep within their doors. Third, the said Man Mountain shall confine his walks to our principal high roads, and not offer to walk or lie down in a meadow or field of corn. Fourth, as he walks the said roads, he shall take the utmost care not to trample upon the bodies of any of our loving subjects, their horses or carriages, nor take any of our said subjects into his hands without their own consent. Fifth, if an express requires extraordinary dispatch, the Man Mountain shall be obliged to carry in his pocket the messenger and horse a 6 days' journey once in every moon, and return the said messenger back, if so required, to our imperial presence. Sixth, he shall be our ally against our enemies in the island of Blefuscu, and do his utmost to destroy their fleet, which is now preparing to invade us. Seventh, that the said Man-Mountain shall, at his times of leisure, be aiding and assisting to our workmen in helping to raise certain great stones towards covering the wall of the principal park and other royal buildings. 8th, that the said Man-Mountain shall, in 2 moons' time, deliver in an exact survey of the circumference of our dominions by a computation of his own paces round the coast. Lastly, that upon his solemn oath to observe all the above articles, the said Man-Mountain shall have a daily allowance of meat and drink sufficient for the support of 1,728 of our subjects, with free access to our royal person and other marks of our favor. Given at our palace at Belfabarak, the 12th day of the 91st moon of our reign. I swore and subscribed to those articles with great cheerfulness, although some of them were not so honorable as I could have wished. My chains were immediately unlocked, and I was at full liberty. The first request I made, after I had obtained my liberty, was that I might have license to my Aldendo, the metropolis, which the emperor easily granted me, but with a special charge to do no hurt either to the inhabitants or their houses. I passed very gently through the 2 principal streets, walking with the utmost circumspection to avoid treading on any stragglers that might remain in the streets, although the orders were very strict, that all people should keep in their houses at their own peril. The garret windows and tops of houses were so crowded with spectators that I thought in all my travels I had not seen a more populous place. The town is capable of holding 500,000 souls. The emperor's palace is in the center of the city, where the 2 great streets meet. The emperor had a great desire that I should see the magnificence of his palace, but this I was only able to do by lying down on my side. I applied my face to the windows of the middle stories, which were left open on purpose, and discovered the most splendid apartments that can be imagined. There I saw the empress and the young princes in their several lodgings, with their chief attendants about them. Her imperial majesty was pleased to smile very graciously upon me, and gave me out of the window her hand to kiss. One morning, about a fortnight after I had obtained my liberty, Rel Dressel, principal secretary of private affairs, came to my house attended only by one servant. He ordered his coach to wait at a distance, and desired I would give him an hour's audience. This I readily consented to, on account of the many good offices he had done me during my solicitations at court. I offered to lie down, that he might the more conveniently reach my ear, but he chose rather to let me hold him in my hand during our conversation. He explained as follows: as flourishing a condition as we may appear to be to foreigners, we labor under 2 mighty evils, a violent faction at home, and the danger of an invasion by a most potent enemy from abroad. As to the first, you are to understand that for above 70 moons past there have been 2 struggling parties in this empire, under the names of Tromixon and Slomixon, from the high and low heels on their shoes, by which they distinguish themselves. His Majesty hath determined to make use of only low heels in the administration of the government. The animosities between these 2 parties run so high that they will neither eat nor drink nor talk with each other. We compute that Tromixon, or high heels, to exceed us in number, but the power is wholly on our side. We apprehend His Imperial Highness, the heir to the crown, to have some tendency towards the high heels. At last we can plainly discover one of his heels higher than the other, which gives him a hobble in his gait. Now, in the midst of these interesting disquiets, we are threatened with an invasion from the island of Blefuscu, which is the other great empire of the universe, almost as large and powerful as this of His Majesty. The 2 great empires of Lilliput and Blefuscu became engaged in a most obstinate war upon the following occasion. It is allowed on all hands that the primitive way of breaking eggs before we eat them was upon the larger end. But His present Majesty's grandfather, while he was a boy going to eat an egg and breaking it according to the ancient practice, happened to cut one of his fingers, whereupon the emperor his father published an edict commanding all his subjects upon great penalties to break the smaller end of their eggs. The people so highly resented this law that our histories tell us there have been 6 rebellions raised on that account, wherein one emperor lost his life and another his crown. These civil commotions were constantly fomented by the monarch of Blefuscu, and when they were quelled, the exiles always fled for refuge to that empire. It is computed that 11,000 persons have, at several times, suffered death, rather than submit to break their eggs at the smaller end. Now the big Indian exiles have found so much credit in the Emperor of Blefuscu's court, and so much private assistance and encouragement from the party here at home, that a bloody war hath been carried on between the two empires for 36 moons with various success. During this time we have lost 40 capital ships and a much greater number of smaller vessels, together with 30,000 of our best seamen and soldiers, and the damage received by the enemy is reckoned to be somewhat greater than ours. However, they have equipped a numerous fleet, and are just preparing to make it descend upon us, and His Imperial Majesty, placing great confidence in your valor and strength, hath commanded me to lay this account of his affairs before you. I desired the Secretary to present my humble duty to the Emperor, and to let him know that I thought it would not become me, who was a foreigner, to interfere with parties, but I was ready with the hazard of my life to defend his person and state against all invaders. The Empire of Blefuscu is an island situated to the north-northeast side of Lilliput, from whence it is parted only by a channel of 800 yards wide. I had not yet seen it, and upon this notice of an intended invasion, I avoided appearing on that side of the coast for fear of being discovered by some of the enemy's ships, who had received no intelligence of me, all intercourse between the two empires having been strictly forbidden during the war, upon pain of death. Furthermore, an embargo had been laid by our emperor upon all vessels whatsoever. I communicated to His Majesty a project I had formed of seizing the enemy's whole fleet, which, as our scouts assured us, lay at anchor in the harbor ready to sail with the first fair wind. I consulted the most experienced seamen upon the depth of the channel. I walked towards the northeast coast over against Blefuscu, and lying down behind a hillock, took out my small pocket perspective glass and viewed the enemy's fleet, consisting of about 50 men of war and a great number of transports. I then came back to my house and gave order for a great quantity of the strongest cable and bars of iron. The cable was about as thick as packthread, and the bars of the length and size of a knitting needle. I trebled the cable to make it stronger, and for the same reason I twisted 3 of the iron bars together, binding the extremities into a hook. Having thus fixed 50 hooks to as many cables, I went back to the northeast coast, and pulling off my coats, shoes, and stockings, walked into the sea in my leathern jerkin about a half hour before high water. I waded with what haste I could, and swam in the middle about 30 yards till I felt ground. I arrived at the fleet in less than half an hour. The enemy was so frightened when they saw me that they leaped out of their ships and swam to shore, where there could not be fewer than 30,000 souls. I then took my tackling and fastened a hook to the hole at the prow of each. I tied all the cords together at the end. While I was thus employed, the enemy discharged several thousand arrows, many of which stuck in my hands and face, and besides the excessive smart, gave me much disturbance in my work. My greatest apprehension was for my eyes, which I should have infallibly lost if I had not suddenly thought of an expedient. I took out my pair of spectacles that had escaped the Emperor's searchers, and fastened them as strongly as I could upon my nose, and thus armed went on boldly with my work. I had now fastened all the hooks, and taking the knot in my hand, I began to pull, and with great ease drew 50 of the enemy's largest men of war after me. The Blefuscudians were at first confounded with astonishment. They had thought my design was only to let the ships run adrift, or fall foul on each other. But when they perceived the whole fleet moving in order, and saw me pulling at the end, they set up such a scream of grief and despair that it is almost impossible to describe or conceive. When I had got out of danger, I stopped a while to pick out the arrows that stuck in my hands and face. I then took off my spectacles, and waiting about an hour till the tide was a little fallen, I waded through the middle with my cargo, and arrived safely at Lilliput. The emperor and his whole court stood on the shore. I came in a short time within hearing, and holding up the end of the cable by which the fleet was fastened, I cried in a loud voice, "Long live the most puissant emperor of Lilliput!" This great prince created me a Nardak on the spot, which is the highest title of honor among them. His Majesty desired I would take some other opportunity of bringing all the rest of his enemy's ships into his ports. He seemed to think of nothing less than reducing the whole empire of Blefuscu into a province, and governing it by a viceroy, of destroying the big Indian exiles, and compelling that people to break the smaller end of their eggs, by which he would remain the sole monarch of the whole world. I plainly protested that I would never be an instrument of bringing a free and brave people into slavery, and when the matter was debated in council, the wisest part of the ministry were of my opinion. This open, bold declaration of mine was so opposite to the schemes and policies of His Imperial Majesty that he could never forgive it. He mentioned it in a very artful manner at council, where I was told that some of the wisest appeared, at least by their silence, to be of my opinion. But others, who were my secret enemies, could not forbear some expressions which by a side wind reflected on me. And from this time began an intrigue between His Majesty and a junto of ministers maliciously bent against me, which broke out in less than 2 months, and had like to have ended in my utter destruction. About 3 weeks after this exploit, there arrived a solemn embassy from Blefuscu, with humble offers of a peace, which was soon concluded upon conditions very advantageous to our emperor. There were 6 ambassadors, with a train of about 500 persons, and their entry was very magnificent, suitable to the grandeur of their master and the importance of their business. When their treaty was finished, their excellencies, who were privately told how much I had been their friend, made me a visit in form. They began with many compliments upon my valor and generosity, and invited me to that kingdom in the emperor their master's name. The next time I had the honor to see our emperor, I desired his general license to wait on the Blefuscudian monarch, which he was pleased to grant me, but in a very cold manner. I could not guess the reasons till I had a whisper from a certain person that Flimnap the treasurer and Bolgolam, the first lord of the Admiralty, had represented my intercourse with those ambassadors as a mark of disaffection, from which I am sure my heart was wholly free. And this was the first time I began to conceive some imperfect idea of courts and minister. It was not long before I had an opportunity of doing His Majesty, at least as I then thought, a most signal service. I was alarmed at midnight with the cries of many hundred people at my door, by which being suddenly awaked, I was in some kind of terror. I heard the word burglum repeated incessantly. Several of the emperor's courts, making their way through the crowd, entreated me to come immediately to the palace, where Her Imperial Majesty's apartment was on fire by the carelessness of a maid of honor who fell asleep while she was reading a romance. I got up in an instant, and orders being given to clear the way before me, and it being likewise a moonshine night, I made a shift to get to the palace without trampling on any of the people. I found they had already applied ladders to the walls of the apartment, and were well provided with buckets, but the water was at some distance. These buckets were about the size of a large thimble, and the poor people supplied me with them as fast as they could, but the flame was so violent that they did little good. I might easily have stifled it with my coat, which I unfortunately left behind me for haste. The case seemed wholly desperate and deplorable, and this magnificent palace would have infallibly been burnt down to the ground, if by a presence of mind, unusual to me, I had not suddenly thought of an expedient. I had the evening before drunk plentifully of a most delicious wine called Glimmergrim, which is very diuretic. By the luckiest chance in the world, I had not discharged myself of my part of it. The heat I had contracted by coming very near the flames, and by laboring to quench them, made the wine begin to operate by urine, which I voided in such a quantity and applied so well to the proper places that in 3 minutes the fire was wholly extinguished, and the rest of that noble pile, which had cost so many ages in erecting, preserved from destruction. It was now daylight, and I returned to my house without waiting to congratulate with the Emperor, because I could not tell how His Majesty might resent the manner by which I had performed it. But I was a little comforted by a message from His Majesty that he would give orders to the Grand Judiciary for passing my pardon in form, which, however, I could not obtain. And I was privately assured that the Empress, conceiving the greatest abhorrence of what I had done, removed to the most distant side of the court, firmly resolved that those buildings should never be repaired for her use, and in the presence of her chief confidants, could not forbear vowing revenge. There are some laws and customs in the Lilliput Empire that are very peculiar. The first I shall mention relates to reward and punishment, which we usually call the two hinges upon which all government turns. Yet I could never observe this maxim to be put in practice by any nation except that of Lilliput. Whoever can there bring sufficient proof that he hath strictly observed the laws of his country for 73 moons hath a claim to certain privileges, according to his quality and condition of life, with a proportionable sum of money out of a fund appropriated for that use. He likewise acquires the title of Snailpaw, or legal, which is added to his name, but does not descend to his posterity. And these people thought it a prodigious defect of policy among us when I told them that our laws were enforced only by penalties, without any mention of reward. It is upon this account that the image of justice in their courts of judicature is formed with 6 eyes, 2 before, as many behind, and on each side 1, to signify circumspection, with a bag of gold open in her right hand, and a sword sheathed in her left, to show she is more disposed to reward than to punish. In choosing persons for all employments, they have more regard to good morals than to great abilities. They think the want of moral values is so far from being supplied by superior endowments of the mind, that employments could never be put into such dangerous hands as those of persons so qualified. At least that the mistakes committed by ignorance in a virtuous disposition would never be of such fatal consequences to the public as the practices of a man whose inclinations led him to be corrupt, and had great abilities to manage and multiply and defend his corruptions. In like manner, the disbelief of a divine providence renders a man incapable of holding any public station. For since kings avow themselves to be the deputies of Providence, the Lilliputians think nothing can be more absurd than for a prince to employ such men as disown the authority under which he acts. In relating these and the following laws, I would only be understood to mean the original institutions, and not the most scandalous corruptions into which these people are fallen by the degenerate nature of man. For as to that infamous practice of acquiring great employments by dancing on the ropes, or badges of favor and distinctions by leaping over sticks and creeping under them, the listener is to observe that they were first introduced by the grandfather of the emperor now reigning, and grew to the present height by the gradual increase of party and faction. Ingratitude is among them a capital crime, for they reason that whoever makes ill returns to his benefactor must needs be a common enemy to the rest of mankind. Their notions relating to the duties of parents and children differ extremely from ours. In order to propagate and continue the species, the Lilliputians will needs have it that men and women are joined together like other animals, by the motives of concupiscence, and that their tenderness towards their young proceeds from the like natural principle. For which reason they will never allow that a child is under any obligation to his father for begetting him, or his mother for bringing him into the world. Upon these reasonings, their opinion is that parents are the last of all others to be trusted with the education of their own children. Therefore they have in every town public nurseries, where all parents except cottagers and laborers are obliged to send their infants of both sexes to be reared and educated when they come to the age of 20 moons, at which time they are supposed to have some rudiments of docility. These schools are of both sexes. They have certain professors well skilled in preparing children for such a condition of life as befits the ranks of their parents, and their own capabilities above all, as well as inclinations. The nurseries for males of noble and eminent birth are provided with grave and learned professors and their several deputies. The parents of these children are suffered to see them only twice a year. The visit is to last but an hour. They are allowed to kiss the child at meeting and parting. The pension from each family for the education and entertainment of a child, upon failure of due payment, is levied by the emperor's officers. In the female nurseries, the children are educated to be reasonable, agreeable, and literate. The cottagers and laborers keep their children at home, their business being only to till and cultivate the earth, and therefore their education is of little consequence to the public. But the old and diseased among them are supported by hospitals, for begging is a trade unknown in this kingdom. One day His Imperial Majesty desired that himself and his royal consort, with the young princes of the blood of both sexes, might have the happiness, as he was pleased to call it, of dining with me. They came accordingly, and I placed them upon chairs of state on my table, just over against me, with their guards about them. Flimnap, the Lord High Treasurer, attended there likewise with his white staff, and I observed he often looked on me with a sour countenance. I have some private reasons to believe that this visit from His Majesty gave Flimnap an opportunity of doing me ill offices to his master. That minister had always been my secret enemy, though he outwardly caressed me more than was usual to the moroseness of his nature. He represented to the emperor the low condition of his treasury. I had cost His Majesty above 1.5 million of sprugs, their greatest gold coin, and upon the whole that it would be advisable in the emperor to take the first fair occasion of dismissing me. I am here obliged to vindicate the reputation of an excellent lady, who was an innocent sufferer upon my account. The treasurer took a fancy to be jealous of his wife, from the malice of some evil tongues, who informed him that her grace had taken a violent affection for my person, and the court scandal ran for some time that she once came privately to my lodging. This I solemnly declare to be a most infamous falsehood. These false informations, which I afterwards came to the knowledge of, made Flimnap show his lady for some time an ill countenance, and me a worse. Although he were at last undeceived and reconciled to her, yet I lost all credit with him and found my interest decline very fast with the emperor himself. Before I proceed to give an account of my leaving this kingdom, it may be proper to inform the listener of a private intrigue which had been for months forming against me. When I was preparing to pay my attendance on the Emperor of Blefuscu, a considerable person at court did come to my house very privately at night, and without sending his name, desired admittance. After the common salutations were over, he desired I would hear him with patience in a matter that highly concerned my honor and my life. His speech was to the following effect. "You are to know," said he, "that several committees of council have been lately called in the most private manner on your account, and it is but 2 days since His Majesty came to a full resolution. You are very sensible that Vogelam, the High Admiral, hath been your mortal enemy almost ever since your arrival. His original reasons I know not, but his hatred is much increased since your great success against Blefuscu, by which his glory as admiral is obscured. This lord, in conjunction with Flimnap the High Treasurer, whose enmity against you is notorious, and the general, the chamberlain, and the grand justiciary, have prepared articles of impeachment against you for treason and other capital crimes. You are accused of maliciously, traitorously, and devilishly putting out the fire in the palace, refusing to devastate Blefuscu upon pretense of unwillingness to force the consciences, or destroy the liberties and lives of an innocent people, having spoken to the peace embassy from Blefuscu, and preparing to take advantage of the emperor's permission to visit Blefuscu. In the several debates upon this impeachment, it must be confessed that His Majesty gave many marks of his great lenity, often urging the services you had done him, and endeavoring to extenuate your crimes. The treasurer and admiral insisted that you should be put to the most painful and ignominious death, by setting fire on your house at night, and the general was to attend with 20,000 men armed with poisoned arrows to shoot you on the face and hands. Some of your servants were to have private orders to strew a poisonous juice on your shirts, which would soon make you tear your own flesh and die in the utmost torture. Reldressel, principal secretary for private affairs, who always approved himself your true friend, was commanded by the emperor to deliver his opinion, which he accordingly did, and therein justified the good thoughts you have of him. He allowed your crimes to be great, but that still there was room for mercy. In consideration of your services, and pursuant to his own merciful disposition, would please to spare your life and only give order to put out both your eyes. He humbly conceived that by this expedient justice might in some measure be satisfied. This proposal was received with the utmost disapprobation by the whole board. The treasurer showed to what straits his Majesty's revenue was reduced by the charge of maintaining you, which would soon grow insupportable. That the secretary's expedient of putting out your eyes was so far from being a remedy against this evil, it would probably increase it, as it is manifest from the common practice of blinding some kind of fowl, after which they fed the faster and grew sooner fat. But his imperial majesty, fully determined against capital punishment, was graciously pleased to say that since the council thought the loss of your eyes too easy a censure, some other may be inflicted hereafter. The secretary, humbly desiring to be heard again, said that his excellency might easily provide against that evil by gradually lessening your establishment, by which, for want of sufficient food, you would grow weak and faint, and lose your appetite, and consequently decay and consume in a few months. Neither would the stench of your carcass be then so dangerous, when it should become more than half diminished, and immediately upon your death, 5 or 6,000 of his Majesty's subjects might, in 2 or 3 days, cut your flesh from your bones, take it away by cartloads, and bury it in distant parts to prevent infection, leaving the skeleton as a monument of admiration to posterity. It was strictly enjoined that the project of starving you out by degrees should be kept a secret, but the sentence of putting out your eyes was entered on the books. None dissenting except Bolgolam the admiral, who, being a creature of the empress, was perpetually instigated by her majesty to insist upon your death, she having borne perpetual malice against you on account of that infamous and illegal method you took to extinguish the fire in her apartment. In 3 days your friend the secretary will be directed to come to your house and read before you the articles of impeachment, and then to signify that great lenity and favor of his majesty and council, whereby you are only condemned to the loss of your eyes, which his majesty doth not question, you will gratefully and humbly submit to. And 20 of his majesty's surgeons will attend in order to see the operation well performed, by discharging very sharp-pointed arrows into the balls of your eyes as you lie on the ground. I leave to your prudence what measures you will take, and to avoid suspicion I must immediately return in as private a manner as I came. His lordship did so, and I remained alone, under many doubts and perplexities of mind. As to myself, I was so ill a judge of things that I could not discover the lenity and favor of this sentence, but conceived it rather to be rigorous than gentle. I sometimes thought of standing my trial, hoping they would admit of some extenuations, but I could not rely on so dangerous a decision in so critical a juncture and against such powerful enemies. Once I was strongly bent upon resistance. The whole strength of that empire could hardly subdue me, and I might easily with stones pelt the metropolis to pieces. But I soon rejected that project with horror, by remembering the oath I had made to the emperor, the favors I received from him, and the high title of Nardak he conferred upon me. At last I fixed upon a resolution, for which it is probable I may incur some censure, and not unjustly, but hurried on by the precipitancy of youth, and having his imperial majesty's license to pay my attendance upon the emperor of Blefuscu, I took this opportunity, before the 3 days were elapsed, to send a letter to my friend the secretary, signifying my resolution of setting out that morning for Blefuscu, pursuant to the leave I had got. Without waiting for an answer, I went to that side of the island where our fleet lay. I seized a large man of war, tied a cable to the prow, and lifting up the anchors, I stripped myself, put my clothes and coverlet into the vessel, and drawing it after me, between wading and swimming, arrived at the royal port of Blefuscu, where the people had long expected me. They lent me 2 guides to direct me to the capital city, which is of the same name. I held them in my hands till I came within 200 yards of the gate, and desired them to signify my arrival to one of the secretaries. I there waited for about an hour. Then His Majesty, attended by the royal family and great officers of the court, came out to receive me. I lay on the ground to kiss His Majesty's and the Empress's hand. I told His Majesty that I was come according to my promise, and with the license of the Emperor my master, to have the honor of seeing so mighty a monarch, and to offer him any service in my power consistent with my duty to my own prince, not mentioning a word of my disgrace. 3 days after my arrival, walking out of curiosity to the northeast coast of the island, I observed, about a half a league off in the sea, some object that looked like a boat overturned. I pulled off my shoes and stockings, and wading 200 or 300 yards, I found the object to be a boat, which I supposed might, by some tempest, have been driven from a ship. I shall not trouble the listener with the difficulties I was under to get my boat to the royal port of Blefuscu, where a mighty concourse of people appeared upon my arrival, full of wonder at the sight of so prodigious a vessel. I told the Emperor that my good fortune had thrown this boat in my way to carry me to some place from whence I might return to my native country, and begged His Majesty's orders for getting materials to fit it up, together with his license to depart, which, after some kind of expostulations, he was pleased to grant. I did very much wonder in all this time not to have heard of any express relating to me from our Emperor to the court of Blefuscu, but I was afterwards given privately to understand that His Imperial Majesty believed I was only gone to Blefuscu in performance of my promise, according to the license he had given me, which was well known at court, and would return in a few days. But he was at last in pain at my long absence, and after consulting with the treasurer and the rest of that cabal, a person of quality was dispatched with a copy of the articles against me. This envoy had instructions to represent to the monarch of Blefuscu that in order to maintain the peace and amity between both empires, his master expected that his brother of Blefuscu would give orders to have me sent back to Lilliput, bound hand and foot, to be punished as a traitor. The Emperor of Blefuscu, having taken 3 days to consult, returned an answer consisting of many civilities and excuses. He said that as far as sending me bound, his brother knew it was impossible, that although I had deprived him of his fleet, yet he owed great obligations to me for many good offices I had done him in making the peace. That, however, both their majesties would soon be made easy, for I had found a prodigious vessel on the shore, able to carry me on the sea, and he hoped in a few weeks both empires would be freed from so insupportable an encumbrance. With this answer, the envoy returned to Lilliput. These considerations moved me to hasten my departure somewhat sooner than I intended, to which the court, impatient to have me gone, very readily contributed. 500 workmen were employed to make 2 sails for my boat, according to my directions. I was at the pains of making ropes and cables by twisting 10, 20, or 30 of the thickest and strongest of theirs. A great stone that I happened to find, after a long search, served me for an anchor. I had the tallow of 300 cows for greasing my boat and other uses. I was at incredible pains in cutting down some of the largest timber trees for oars and masts. In about a month, when all was prepared, I sent to receive His Majesty's commands and to take my leave. The Emperor and the royal family came out of the palace. I lay down on my face to kiss his hand, which he very graciously gave me. So did the Empress and young princes of the blood. His Majesty presented me with 50 purses of 200 sprugs apiece, together with his picture at full length, which I put immediately into one of my gloves to keep it from being hurt. The ceremonies at my departure were too many to trouble the listener with at this time. I stored the boat with the carcasses of 100 oxen and 300 sheep, with bread and drink proportionable, and as much meat ready dressed as 400 cooks could provide. I took with me 6 cows and 2 bulls alive, with as many ewes and rams, intending to carry them into my own country and propagate the breed. And to feed them on board, I had a good bundle of hay and a bag of corn. I would gladly have taken a dozen of the natives, but this was a thing the Emperor would by no means permit. And besides a diligent search of my pockets, His Majesty engaged my honor not to carry away any of his subjects, although with their own consent and desire. Having thus prepared all things as well as I was able, I set sail on the 24th day of September, 1701, at 6 in the morning. My intention was to reach, if possible, one of those islands which I had reason to believe lay to the northeast of Van Diemen's Land. When I had made 24 leagues from Blefuscu, I descried a sail steering to the southeast. In half an hour she spied me, then hung out her ancient and discharged a gun. It is not easy to express the joy I was in upon the unexpected hope of once more seeing my beloved country and the dear pledges I had left in it. The ship slackened her sails, and I came upon her between 5 and 6 in the evening, September 26th. But my heart leapt within me to see her English colors. I put my cows and sheep into my coat pockets, and got on board with all my little cargo of provisions. The vessel was an English merchantman, returning from Japan by the North and South Seas. The captain, Mr. John Biddle of Deptford, a very civil man, and an excellent sailor, treated me with kindness, and desired I would let him know what place I had come from last, and whither I was bound, which I did in a few words, but he thought I was raving, and that the dangers I underwent had disturbed my head. Whereupon I took my black cattle and sheep out of my pocket, which, after great astonishment, clearly convinced him of my veracity. I then showed him the gold given me by the Emperor of Blefuscu, together with His Majesty's picture at full length, and some other rarities of that country. I shall not trouble the listener with a particular account of this voyage. We arrived in the Downs on the 13th of April, 1702. I stayed for 2 months with my wife and family, for my insatiable desire of seeing foreign countries would suffer me to continue no longer. I left £1,500 with my wife, and fixed her in a good house at Redriff. My remaining stock I carried with me, part in money and part in goods, in hopes to improve my fortunes. I took leave of my wife and boy and girl, with tears on both sides, and went on board the Adventure, a merchant ship of 300 tons, bound for Surat. Part 2. A Voyage to Brobdingnag. On board the Adventure, we had a very prosperous gale till we arrived at the Cape of Good Hope, where we landed for fresh water, but discovering a leak, we unshipped our goods and wintered there. The captain had fallen sick of an ague, so we could not leave the Cape till the end of March. We then set sail and had a good voyage till we passed the Straits of Madagascar. On the 19th of April, the winds began to blow with a much greater violence, and more westerly than usual, continuing so for 20 days. On the 2nd of May, the wind ceased, and it was a perfect calm, whereas I was not a little rejoiced. But our captain bid us all to prepare against a storm, which accordingly happened the day following, for a southern wind called the southern monsoon began to set in. During this storm, which was followed by a strong wind, west-southwest, we were carried about 500 leagues to the east, so that the oldest sailor on board could not tell in what part of the world we were. On the 16th day of June, 1703, a boy on the topmast discovered land. On the 17th, we came in full view of a great island or continent, for we knew not whether, on the south side whereof was a small neck of land jutting out into the sea, and a creek too shallow to hold a ship of above 100 tons. We cast anchor within a league on this creek, and our captain sent a dozen of his men well armed in the longboat, with vessels for water, if any could be found. I desired his leave to go with them, that I might see the country, and make what discoveries I could. When we came to land, we saw no river or spring, nor any sign of inhabitants. Our men therefore wandered on the shore to find some fresh water near the sea, and I walked alone about a mile on the other side, where I observed a country all barren and rocky. I now began to be weary, and returned gently down towards the creek. The sea being full in my view, I saw our men already got into the boat and rowing for life to the ship. I was going to holler after them, when I observed a huge creature walking after them in the sea, as fast as he could. He waded not much deeper than his knees, and took prodigious strides. But the sea thereabouts being full of sharp-pointed rocks, the monster was not able to overtake the boat. I ran as fast as I could the way I first went, and then climbed up a steep hill, which gave me some prospect of the country. I found it fully cultivated, but that which first surprised me was the length of the grass, which in those grounds that seemed to be kept for hay, was almost 20 foot high. I fell into a high road. There I walked for some time, but could see little on either side, it being now near harvest, and the corn rising at least 40 foot. I was an hour walking on the end of this field, which was fenced in with a hedge of at least 120 foot high, and the trees so lofty that I could make no computation of their altitude. There was a stile to pass from this field into the next. It had 4 steps and a stone to cross over when you came to the uppermost. It was impossible for me to climb this stile, because every step was 6 foot high, and the upper stone above 20. I was endeavoring to find some gap in the hedge, when I discovered one of the inhabitants in the next field advancing toward the stile, of the same size with him whom I saw on the sea pursuing our boat. He appeared as tall as an ordinary spire steeple, and took about 10 yards at every stride. I was struck with the utmost fear and astonishment, and ran to hide myself in the corn. I heard him call in a voice many degrees louder than a speaking trumpet, but the noise was so high in the air that at first I certainly thought it was thunder, whereupon 7 monsters like himself came towards him with reaping hooks in their hands, each hook about the largeness of 6 scythes. These people were not so well clad as the first, whose servants or laborers they seemed to be, for upon some words he spoke, they went to reap the corn in the field where I lay. I kept from them as great a distance as I could, but was forced to move with extreme difficulty, for the stalks of the corn were sometimes not above a foot distant, so that I could hardly squeeze my body betwixt them. I heard the reapers not above 100 yards behind me. Being quite dispirited with toil, and wholly overcome by grief and despair, I lay down between 2 ridges, and heartily wished I might there end my days. Scared and confounded as I was, I could not forbear going on with these reflections, when one of the reapers, approaching within 10 yards of the ridge where I lay, made me apprehend that with the next step I should be squashed to death under his foot, or cut in 2 with his reaping hook. And therefore, when he was again about to move, I screamed as loud as fear could make me. Whereupon the huge creature trod short, and looking round about under him for some time, at last espied me as I lay on the ground. He considered a while, with the caution of one who endeavors to lay hold on a small, dangerous animal in such a manner that it shall not be able either to scratch or to bite him. At length he ventured to take me up behind by the middle between his forefinger and thumb, and brought me within 3 yards of his eyes, that he might behold my shape more perfectly. I apprehended every moment that he would dash me against the ground, as we usually do any little hateful animal which we have a mind to destroy. But my good star would have it that he began to look upon me as a curiosity, much wondering to hear me pronounce articulate words, although he could not understand them. In the meantime, I was not able to forbear groaning and shedding tears, letting him know as well as I could how cruelly I was hurt by the pressure of his thumb and finger. He seemed to apprehend my meaning, for lifting up the lappet of his coat, he put me gently into it, and immediately ran along with me to his master, who was a substantial farmer, and the same person I had first seen in the field. The farmer spoke to me, but the sound of his voice pierced my ears like that of a water-mill. I answered as loud as I could, in several languages, and he often laid his ear within 2 yards of me, but all in vain, for we were wholly unintelligible to each other. He then sent his servants to their work, and taking his handkerchief out of his pocket, he doubled and spread it on his left hand, which he placed flat on the ground, with the palm upwards, making me a sign to step into it. I thought it my part to obey, and for fear of falling, laid myself at length upon the handkerchief, with the remainder of which he lapped me up to the head for further security, and in this manner carried me home to his house. There he called his wife and showed me to her, but she screamed and ran back, as women in England do at the sight of a toad or a spider. However, when she had a while seen my behavior, and how well I observed the signs her husband made, she was soon reconciled, and by degrees grew extremely tender of me. It was about 12 at noon, and a servant brought in dinner. It was only one substantial dish of meat, about 4 and 20 foot diameter. The company were the farmer and his wife, 3 children, and an old grandmother. When they were sat down, the farmer placed me at some distance from him on the table, which was 30 foot high from the floor. I was in a terrible fright, and kept as far as I could from the edge for fear of falling. The wife minced a bit of meat, then crumbled some bread on a trencher, and placed it before me. I made her a low bow, took out my knife and fork, and fell to eat, which gave them exceeding delight. The mistress sent her maid for a small dram cup, which held about 3 gallons, and filled it with drink. I took up the vessel with much difficulty in both hands, and in a most respectful manner drank to her ladyship's health, expressing the words as loud as I could in English, which made the company laugh so heartily that I was almost deafened with the noise. This liquor tasted like a small cider, and was not unpleasant. Then the master made me a sign to come to his trencher's side, but as I walked on the table I happened to stumble against a crust, and fell flat on my face, but received no hurt. I got up immediately, and observing the good people to be in much concern, I took my hat and waved it over my head, making 3 huzzas to show that I had got no mischief from my fall. But advancing forwards toward my master, as I shall henceforth call him, his youngest son, who sat next to him, an arch boy of about 10 years old, took me up by the legs and held me so high in the air that I trembled every limb. But his father snatched me from him, and at the same time gave him such a box on the left ear as would have felled a European troop of horses to the earth, ordering him to be taken from the table. But being afraid the boy might owe me a spite, I fell on my knees, and pointing to the boy, made my master to understand, as well as I could, that I desired his son might be pardoned. The father complied, and the lad took a seat again, whereupon I went to him and kissed his hand, which my master took, and made him stroke me gently with it. In the midst of dinner, my mistress's favorite cat leapt into her lap. I heard a noise behind me like that of a dozen stocking weavers at work, and turning my head, I found it proceeded from the purring of this animal, who seemed to be 3 times larger than an ox, as I computed by the view of her head and one of her paws, while her mistress was feeding and stroking her. The fierceness of this creature's countenance altogether decomposed me, but it happened there was no danger, for the cat took not the least notice of me when my master placed me within 3 yards of her. I had less apprehension concerning the dogs, whereof 3 or 4 came into the room. When dinner was almost done, the nurse came in with a child a year old in her arms, who immediately spied me, and began a squall you might have heard from London Bridge to Chelsea, after the usual oratory of infants, to get me for a plaything. The mother, out of pure indulgence, took me up and put me towards the child, who presently seized me by the middle and got my head in his mouth, where I roared so loud that the urchin was frightened and let me drop, and I should infallibly have broke my neck if the mother had not held her apron under me. When dinner was done, my master went out to his laborers, and as I could discover by his voice and gesture, gave his wife a strict charge to take care of me. I was very much tired and disposed to sleep, which my mistress perceiving, she put me on her own bed and covered me with a clean white handkerchief, but larger and coarser than the mainsail of a man-of-war. I slept about 2 hours, and dreamed I was at home with my wife and children, which aggravated my sorrows when I awakened and found myself alone in a vast room, between 200 and 300 foot wide, and above 200 high, lying in a bed 20 yards wide. My mistress had gone about her household affairs, and had locked me in. The bed was 8 yards from the floor. Some natural necessities required me to get down, I durst not presume to call, and if I had, it would have been in vain with such a voice as mine, at so great a distance from the room where I lay to the kitchen where the family kept. While I was under these circumstances, 2 rats crept up the curtains and ran, smelling, backwards and forwards on the bed. One of them came up almost to my face, whereupon I rose in a fright and drew out my hanger to defend myself. These horrible animals had the boldness to attack me on both sides, and one of them held his 4 feet at my collar. But I had the good fortune to rip up his belly before he could do me any mischief. He fell down at my feet, and the other, seeing the fate of his comrade, made his escape, but not without one good wound on the back, which I gave him as he fled, and made the blood run trickling from him. After this exploit, I walked gently to and fro on the bed, to recover my breath and loss of spirits. These creatures were of the size of a large mastiff, but infinitely more nimble and fierce, so that if I had taken off my belt before I went to sleep, I must have infallibly been torn to pieces and devoured. Soon after, my mistress came into the room, who, seeing me all bloody, ran and took me up in her hand. I pointed to the dead rat, smiling and making other signs to show I was not hurt, whereat she was extremely rejoiced, calling the maid to take up the dead rat with a pair of tongs and throw it out the window. Then she set me on a table, where I showed her my hanger all bloody, and wiping it on the lappet of my coat, returned it to the scabbard. I was pressed to do more than one thing, which another could not do for me, and therefore endeavored to make my mistress understand that I desired to be set down on the floor, which after she had done, my bashfulness would not suffer me to express myself farther than by pointing to the door and bowing several times. The good woman, with much difficulty at last, perceived what I would be at, and taking me up again in her hand, walked into the garden, where she set me down. I went on one side about 200 yards, and beckoning her not to look or to follow me, I hid myself between 2 leaves of sorrel, and there discharged the necessities of nature. My mistress had a daughter of 9 years old, very dexterous at her needle, and skilful in dressing the baby. Her mother and she contrived to fit up the baby's cradle for me, against night. This was my bed all the time I stayed with those people, though made more convenient by degrees as I began to learn their language and make my wants known. This young girl was so handy that after I had once or twice pulled off my clothes before her, she was able to dress and undress me, though I never gave her that trouble when she would let me do either myself. She made me 7 shirts, and some other linen, of as fine cloth as could be got, which indeed was coarser than sackcloth, and these she constantly washed for me with her own hands. She was likewise my schoolmistress, to teach me the language. When I pointed to anything, she told me the name of it in her own tongue, so that in a few days I was able to call for whatever I had a mind to. She was very good-natured, and not above 40 foot high, being little for her age. She gave me the name of Grildrig, which the family took up, and afterwards the whole kingdom. To her I chiefly owe my preservation in that country. We never parted while I was there. I called her my Glumdalclitch, or little nurse, and I should be guilty of great ingratitude if I omitted this honorable mention of her care and affection towards me. It now began to be known and talked of in the neighborhood that my master had found a strange little animal in the field, exactly shaped in every part like a human creature, which it likewise imitated in all its actions. My master, pursuant to the advice of his friends, carried me in a box on the next market day to the neighboring town, and took along with him his little daughter, my nurse. The box was close on every side, with a little door for me to go in and out, and a few gimlet holes to let in air. I was terribly shaken and discomposed in this journey, though it were but of half an hour, for the horse went about 40 foot at every step, and trotted so high that the agitation was equal to the rising and falling of a ship in a great storm, but much more frequent. My master alighted at an inn which he used to frequent, and after consulting a while with the innkeeper, he hired the Grultrud, or crier, to give notice through the town of a strange creature to be seen at the sign of the Green Eagle. I was that day shown to 12 sets of company, and for whom I engaged in such fopperies as drinking a thimble filled with liquor, and flourishing my hanger after the manner of fencers in England. I was half dead with weariness and vexation. Those who had seen me made such wonderful reports that the people were ready to break down the doors to come in. My master, for his own interest, would not suffer anyone to touch me except my nurse, and to prevent danger, benches were set round the table at such a distance as put me out of everybody's reach. Soon finding how profitable I was likely to be, he resolved to carry me to the most considerable cities of the kingdom. Having therefore provided himself with all things necessary for a long journey, and settled his affairs at home, he took leave of his wife, and upon the 17th of August, 1703, about 2 months after my arrival, we set out for the metropolis situated near the middle of that empire, and about 3,000 miles distant from our house. Glumdalclitch carried me on her lap in a box tied about her waist. On the 26th day of October, we arrived in the metropolis, called in their language Lorbegrud, or Pride of the Universe. My master took a lodging in the principal street of the city, and hired a large room with a table 60 foot in diameter, upon which I was to act my part. I was shown 10 times a day, to the wonder and satisfaction of all people. I could now speak the language tolerably well, and perfectly understood every word that was spoken to me, for Glumdalclitch had been my instructor while we were at home, and at leisure hours during our journey. The frequent labors I underwent every day made in a few weeks a very considerable change in my health. The more my master got by me, the more unsatiable he grew. I had quite lost my stomach, and was almost reduced to a skeleton. The farmer observed it, and concluding I must soon die, resolved to make as good a hand of me as he could. While he was thus reasoning and resolving with himself, a messenger from court visited, commanding my master to carry me immediately thither for the diversion of the Queen and her lady. Her Majesty and those who attended her were beyond measure delighted by my demeanor. She held out her little finger towards me, after I was set on a table, which I embraced in both my arms, and put the tip of it with the utmost respect to my lip. She made me some general questions about my country and my travels, and asked whether I would be content to live at court. I bowed and humbly answered that I was my master's slave, but if I were at my own disposal, I would be proud to devote my life to Her Majesty's service. She then asked my master whether he were willing to sell me at a good price. He, who apprehended I could not live a month, was ready enough to part with me, and demanded 1,000 pieces of gold, which were ordered him on the spot. I then said to the Queen that I must beg the favor that Glumdalclitch be admitted to her service, and continue to be my nurse and instructor. Her Majesty agreed to my petition, and easily got the farmer's consent, who was glad enough to have his daughter preferred at court. And the poor girl herself was not able to hide her joy. My late master withdrew, bidding me farewell, and saying he had left me in good service, to which I replied not a word, only making him a slight bow. The Queen took me in her hand, and carried me to the King, who was then retired to his cabinet. His Majesty, a prince of much gravity and austere countenance, asked me to give an account of myself, which I did in a very few words. The King conceived I might be a piece of clockwork, contrived by some ingenious artist. He sent for 3 great scholars, who examined my shape with much nicety, but were of different opinions concerning me. They all agreed that I could not be produced according to the regular laws of nature, because I was not framed with the capacity of preserving my life, either by swiftness, or climbing up trees, or digging holes in the earth. They observed by my teeth that I was a carnivorous animal, yet most quadrupeds being an overmatch for me, and field mice with some others too nimble, they could not imagine how I should be able to support myself. One of these virtuosi seemed to think I might be an embryo, or abortive birth, but this opinion was rejected by the other 2, who observed my limbs to be perfect and finished, and that I had lived several years, as it was manifested from my beard. They would not allow me to be a dwarf, because the Queen's favorite dwarf, the smallest ever known in that kingdom, was nearly 30 foot high. After much debate, they concluded unanimously that I was not a product of occult causes. I assured His Majesty that I came from a country which abounded with several millions of both sexes, and of my own stature, where the animals, trees, and houses were all in proportion, and where by consequence I might be as able to defend myself and to find sustenance. The king desired the queen to order that a particular care should be taken of me and my nurse. A convenient apartment was provided for her at court. She had a sort of governess appointed to take care of her education, a maid to dress her, and 2 other servants for menial offices. But the care of me was wholly appropriated to herself. The queen commanded her own cabinet-maker to contrive a box that might serve me for a bedchamber. This man was a most ingenious artist, and according to my directions, in 3 weeks finished for me a wooden chamber of 16 foot square and 12 high, with sash windows, a door, and 2 closets, like a London bedchamber. A nice workman, who was famous for little curiosities, undertook to make me a bed and 2 chairs and a cabinet to put my things in. The room was quilted on all sides to prevent any accident from the carelessness of those who carried me. I desired a lock for my door, to prevent rats and mice from coming in. The smith made the smallest that ever was seen among them. The queen likewise ordered the thinnest silks that could be gotten to make me clothes. They were after the fashion of the kingdom, partly resembling the Persian and partly the Chinese. The queen became so fond of my company that she could not dine without me. I had a table placed upon the same at which Her Majesty ate, just at her left elbow, and a chair to sit on. Glumdalclitch stood upon a stool on the floor, near my table, to assist and take care of me. No person dined with the queen but the 2 princesses royal, the elder 16 years old, and the younger 13. Her Majesty's diversion was to see me eat in miniature, for the queen took up at one mouthful as much as a dozen English farmers could eat at a meal, which to me was for some time a very nauseous sight. She would crunch the wing of a lark, bones and all, between her teeth, although it were 9 times as large as that of a full-grown turkey. It was the custom that every Wednesday the king and queen, with the royal issue of both sexes, dined together in the apartment of His Majesty, to whom I had now become a great favorite. At these times my little chair and table were placed at his left hand. This prince took a pleasure in conversing with me, inquiring into the manners, religion, laws, government, and learning of Europe, wherein I gave him the best account I was able. His apprehension was so clear, and his judgment so exact, that he made reflections and observations upon all I said. He observed how contemptible a thing was human grandeur, which could be mimicked by such diminutive insects as I. And yet, said he, these creatures have their titles and distinctions of honor. They contrive little nests and burrows, that they call houses and cities. They make a figure and dress and equipage. They love, they fight, they dispute, they cheat, they betray. And thus he continued on, while my color came and went several times with indignation to hear our noble country so contemptuously treated. A coach was allowed to Glumdalclitch and me, wherein her governess frequently took her out to see the town or go among the shops, and I was always at the party, carried in my box, although the girl at my own desire would often take me out and hold me in her hand that I might more conveniently view the houses and the people as we passed along the streets. One day the governess ordered our coachman to stop at several shops, where the beggars, watching their opportunity, crowded at the sides of the coach, and gave me the most horrible spectacles that ever an English eye beheld. There was a woman with a cancer in her breast, swelled to a monstrous size, full of holes, in 2 or 3 of which I could have easily crept and covered my whole body. There was a fellow with a couple of wooden legs, each about 20 foot high. But the most hateful sight of all was the lice crawling on their clothes. I could see distinctly the limbs of these vermin with my naked eye, and their snouts with which they rooted like swine. The sight was so nauseous that it perfectly turned my stomach. The Queen also ordered a padded traveling box made for me. Two strong staples were fixed to one side, through which the person that carried me, when I had a mind to be on horseback, put in a leathern belt and buckled it about his waist. I should have lived happily enough in that country if my littleness had not exposed me to several ridiculous and troublesome accidents. One day we were exploring the garden. Glumdalclitch, believing she had put me in a secure place, went to another part of the garden with her governess. A small white spaniel, belonging to one of the chief gardeners, had got by accident into the garden and happened to range near the place where I lay. The dog came directly up, and taking me in his mouth, ran straight to his master, wagging his tail, and set me gently on the ground. By good fortune he had been so well taught that I was carried between his teeth without the least hurt, or even tearing my clothes. But the poor gardener was in a terrible fright. The maids of honor often invited Glumdalclitch to their apartments, and desired she would bring me along with her, on purpose to have the pleasure of seeing and touching me. They would often strip me naked from top to toe and lay me at full length in their bosoms, wherewith I was much disgusted, because, to say the truth, a very offensive smell came from their skins, but I conceived that my sense was more acute in proportion to my littleness. The greatest danger I ever underwent in that kingdom was from a monkey, who belonged to one of the clerks of the kitchen. He espied me one day and dragged me out of my box, taking me up in his right forefoot and holding me as a nurse does a child she's going to suckle. And when I offered to struggle, he squeezed me so hard that I thought it more prudent to submit. I have good reason to believe that he took me for a young one of his own species, by his often stroking my face very gently with his other paw. The monkey was seen by hundreds in the court, sitting upon the ridge of a building, holding me like a baby in one of his forepaws, and feeding me with the other, by cramming into my mouth some victuals and patting me when I would not eat. Many of the rabble below could not forbear laughing, neither do I think they justly ought to be blamed, for without question the sight was ridiculous enough to everybody but myself. Ladders were applied and mounted by several men. The monkey observed this, and finding himself almost encompassed, and not being able to make speed enough with his 3 legs, let me drop on a ridge tile and made his escape. Here I sat for some time 300 yards from the ground, expecting every moment to be blown down by the wind. But one of my nurse's footmen climbed up, and putting me into his breeches pocket, brought me down safe. I was almost choked with the filthy stuff the monkey had crammed down my throat, and I was so weak and bruised in the sides with the squeezes given me by this odious animal that I was forced to keep my bed a fortnight. The king, queen, and all the court sent every day to inquire after my health, and Her Majesty made me several visits during my sickness. The monkey was killed, and an order made that no such animal should be kept about the palace. The king was a prince of excellent understanding, and would frequently order that I should be brought in my box and set upon a table in his closet. He would then command me to bring one of my chairs out of the box and sit down within 3 yards' distance upon the top of the cabinet, which brought me almost to a level with his face. In this manner I had several conversations with him. I one day took the freedom to tell His Majesty that the contempt he discovered towards Europe and the rest of the world did not seem answerable to those excellent qualities of the mind he was master of. The king heard me with attention, and desired I would give him as exact an account of the government of England as I possibly could, because, as fond as princes commonly are of their own customs, he should be glad to hear of anything that might deserve imitation. This conversation was not ended under 5 audiences, each of several hours. I furnished the king with a brief historical account of affairs and events in England for about 100 years past. In a 6th audience, His Majesty proposed many doubts, queries, and objections upon every article I had raised. It was his opinion that English history was nothing but, as he put it, a heap of conspiracies, rebellions, murders, massacres, revolutions, banishments, The very worst effects that avarice, faction, hypocrisy, perfidiousness, cruelty, rage, madness, hatred, envy, lust, malice, or ambition could produce. It was his belief that the bulk of my countrymen are the most pernicious race of odious little vermin that nature ever suffered to crawl upon the surface of the earth. I concluded that the king's lack of enthusiasm for my country sprang from his ignorance of my beloved land, and that it was my duty to act as his tutor and teach him everything about England's magnificence. In hopes to ingratiate myself farther into His Majesty's favor, I told him of an invention discovered between 300 and 400 years ago, to make a certain powder into a heap of which the smallest spark of fire falling would kindle the whole in a moment, although it were as big as a mountain, and make it all fly up in the air together with a noise and agitation greater than thunder. That a proper quantity of this powder, rammed into a hollow tube of brass or iron or lead, with violence and speed, would not only destroy whole ranks of an army at once, but batter the strongest walls to the ground, and sink down ships with 1,000 men in each to the bottom of the sea. I told him how we often put this powder into large hollow balls of iron, and discharged them by an engine into some city we were besieging, which would rip up the pavements, tear the houses to pieces, and dash out the brains of all who came near. That I knew the ingredients very well, which were cheap and common. I understood the manner of compounding them, and could direct his workmen how to make these tubes of a size proportionable to all other things in His Majesty's kingdom. This I humbly offered to His Majesty, as a small tribute of acknowledgment in return of so many marks that I had received of his royal favor and protection. The king was struck with horror at the description I had given of those terrible engines and the proposal I had made. He was amazed how so impotent and groveling an insect as I, these were his expressions, could entertain such inhuman ideas. He protested that, although few things delighted him so much as new discoveries in art or in nature, yet he would rather lose half his kingdom than be privy to such a secret, which he commanded me, as I valued my life, never to mention any more. I came to realize that the learning of these people is very defective, consisting only in morality, history, poetry, and mathematics, wherein they must be allowed to excel. But the last of these is wholly applied to what may be useful in life, to the improvement of agriculture and all mechanical arts, so that among us it would be little esteemed. And as to ideas, entities, abstractions, and transcendentals, I could never drive the least conception into their heads. No law of that country must exceed in words the number of letters in their alphabet, which consists only in 22. But indeed few of them extend even to that length. They are expressed in the most plain and simple terms, wherein these people are not mercurial enough to discover above one interpretation, and to write a comment upon any law is a capital crime. As to the decision of civil causes or proceedings against criminals, their precedents are so few that they have very little reason to boast of any extraordinary skill in either. They have had the art of printing, as well as the Chinese, time out of mind, but their libraries are not very large, for that of the kings, which is reckoned the biggest, doth not amount to above 1,000 volumes. Their style is clear, masculine, and smooth, but not florid, for they avoid nothing more than multiplying unnecessary words or using various expressions. I have perused many of their books, especially those in history and morality. Among the rest, I was much diverted with a little old treatise which always lay in Glumberclitch's bedchamber, and belonged to her governess. This writer went through all the usual topics of European moralists, showing how diminutive, contemptible, and helpless an animal was man in his own nature, how unable to defend himself from the inclemencies of the air, or the fury of wild beasts, or how much he was excelled by one creature in strength, by another in speed, by a third in foresight, and a fourth in industry. He said, it was very reasonable to think, not only that the species of men were originally much larger, but also that there must have been giants in former ages, far exceeding the common dwindled race of man in our days. He argued that the very laws of nature absolutely required that we should have been made in the beginning of a size more large and robust, not so liable to destruction from every little accident of a tile falling from a house, or a stone cast from the hand of a boy, or of being drowned in a little brook. From this way of reasoning, the author drew several moral applications useful in the conduct of life. I had always a strong impulse that I should some time recover my liberty, though it was impossible to conjecture by what means, or to form any project with the least hope of succeeding. The king was strongly bent to get me a woman of my own size, by whom I might propagate the breed. But I think I should rather have died than undergone the disgrace of leaving a posterity to be kept in cages like tame canary birds, and perhaps, in time, sold about the kingdom to persons of quality for curiosities. I was indeed treated with much kindness. I was the favorite of a great king and queen, and the delight of the whole court. But it was upon such a foot as ill became the dignity of humankind. I wanted to be among people with whom I could converse upon even terms, and walk about the streets and fields without fear of being trod to death like a frog or a young puppy. But my deliverance came sooner than I expected, and in a manner not very common. I had now been 2 years in this country, and about the beginning of the third, Glumdalclitch and I attended the king and queen in a progress to the south coast of the kingdom. I was carried, as usual, in my traveling box. When we came to our journey's end, the king thought proper to pass a few days at a place he hath near Llanflasnic, a city within 18 English miles of the seaside. Glumdalclitch and I were much fatigued. I had gotten a small cold, but the poor girl was so ill as to be confined to her chamber. I longed to see the ocean, which must be the only scene of my escape, if ever it should happen. I pretended to be worse than I really was, and desired leave to take the fresh air of the sea, with a page whom I was very fond of, and who had sometimes been trusted with me. I shall never forget with what unwillingness Glumdalclitch consented, nor the strict charge she gave the page to be careful of me, bursting at the same time into a flood of tears, as if she had some foreboding of what was about to happen. The boy took me out in my box, about half an hour's walk from the palace, towards the rocks on the seashore. I ordered him to set me down. I found myself not very well, and told the page that I had a mind to take a nap in my hammock, which I hoped would do me good. I soon fell asleep, and all I can conjecture is that while I slept, the page, thinking no danger could happen, went among the rocks to look for birds' eggs. Be that as it will, I found myself suddenly awakened with a violent pull upon the ring which was fastened at the top of my box for the conveniency of carriage. I felt my box raised very high in the air, and then borne forward with prodigious speed. I heard a noise just over my head, like the clapping of wings, and then began to perceive the woeful condition I was in, that some eagle had got the ring of my box in his beak, with an intent to let it fall on a rock like a tortoise in a shell, and then pick out my body and devour it. All of a sudden, I felt myself falling perpendicularly down for above a minute, but with such incredible swiftness that I almost lost my breath. My fall was stopped by a terrible squash that sounded louder to my ears than the cataract of Niagara. I now perceived that I was fallen into the sea. My box floated about 5 foot deep in water. I expected every moment to see my box dashed in pieces, or at least overset by a rising wave. A breach in one single pane of glass would have been immediate death, nor could anything have preserved the windows but the strong lattice wires placed on the south side against accidents and traveling. I saw the water ooze in at several crannies, although the leaks were not considerable, and I endeavored to stop them as well as I could. But if I escaped these dangers for a day or two, what could I expect but a miserable death of cold and hunger? I was 4 hours under these circumstances, expecting and indeed wishing every moment to be my last. It was then I heard, or at least thought I heard, some kind of grating noise on that side of the box where the staples were fixed. Soon after I began to fancy that the box was pulled or towed along in the sea, for now and then I felt a sort of tugging, which made the waves rise near the tops of my windows, leaving me almost in the dark. This gave me some faint hopes of relief, although I was not able to imagine how it could be brought about. I plainly heard a noise upon the cover of my closet, like that of a cable, and the grating of it as it passed through the ring. I then found myself hoisted up by degrees at least 3 foot higher than I was before. Whereupon I began calling for help till I was almost hoarse, in return to which I heard a great shout repeated 3 times, giving me such transports of joy as are not to be conceived. I now heard a trampling over my head, and somebody calling through the hole with a loud voice in the English tongue, "This is Captain Wilcox. If there be anybody below, let them speak." I answered, I was an Englishman drawn by ill fortune into the greatest calamity that ever any creature underwent, and begged by all that is moving to be delivered out of the dungeon I was in. The voice replied, I was safe, for my box was fastened to their ship. The captain, Mr. Thomas Wilcox, was an honest, worthy Shropshire man. Seeing me on board, he observed I was ready to faint, and took me into his cabin, gave me a cordial to comfort me, and advised me to take a little rest, of which I had great need. Before I went to sleep, I gave him to understand that I had some valuable furniture in my box, too good to be lost. The captain concluded I was raving. However, he sent some of his men on deck to draw up all my goods. I slept some hours, but perpetually disturbed with dreams of the place I had left, and the dangers I had escaped. However, upon waking, I found myself much recovered. The captain ordered supper immediately, and entertained me with great kindness, observing me not to look wildly or talk inconsistently, and when we were left alone, desired I would give him a relation of my travels, and by what accident I came to be set adrift in that monstrous wooden chest. The captain, having been at Tonkin, was in his return to England driven northeastward to the latitude of 44 degrees and of a longitude 143. Our voyage was very prosperous, but I shall not trouble the listener with a journal of it. I never went out of the ship till we came into the Downs, which was on the 3rd day of June, 1706, about 9 months after my escape. I offered to leave my goods in security for payment of my freight, but the captain protested he would not receive 1 farthing. We took kind leave of each other, and I made him promise he would come to see me at my house in Redriff. As I was on the road home, observing the littleness of the houses, the trees, the cattle, and the people, I began to think myself in Lilliput. I was afraid of trampling on every traveler I met, and often called aloud to have them stand out of the way. When I came to my house, I bent down to go in for fear of striking my head. My wife ran out to embrace me, but I stooped lower than her knees, thinking she would otherwise never be able to reach my mouth. I told my wife she had been too thrifty, for I found she had starved herself to nothing. In short, I behaved myself so unaccountably that she and my 2 children concluded I had lost my wits. In a little time, I and my family and friends came to a right understanding. But my wife protested I should never go to sea any more, although my evil destiny so ordered that she had not power to hinder me, as the listener may know hereafter. Part 3. A Voyage to Laputa, Balnabarbi, Lugnag, Glubbdubdrib, and Japan. I had not been at home above 10 days when Captain William Robinson, commander of the Hopewell, a stout ship of 300 tons, came to my house. I had formerly been surgeon of another ship where he was master. He expressed his joy to find me in good health, and asked whether I were now settled for life, adding that he intended a voyage to the East Indies in 2 months, and would like me to be surgeon of the ship. I found I could not reject his proposal. The thirst I had of seeing the world, notwithstanding my past misfortunes, continued as violent as ever. The only difficulty that remained was to persuade my wife, whose consent, however, I at last obtained by the prospect of advantage she proposed to her children. We set out the 5th of August, 1706, and arrived at Fort St. George the 11th of April, 1707. We stayed there 3 weeks to refresh our crew, many of whom were sick. From thence we went to Tonkin, where the captain resolved to continue some time, because many of the goods he intended to buy were not ready. Therefore, in hopes to defray some of the charges he must be at, he bought a sloop, loaded it with several sorts of goods, and putting 14 men on board, he appointed me master of the sloop and gave me power to traffic for 2 months, while he transacted his affairs at Tonkin. We had not sailed above 3 days, when a great storm arising, we were driven 5 days to the north-northeast, and then to the east. Upon the 10th day, we were chased by 2 pirate ships, who soon overtook us. The largest of the 2 pirate ships was commanded by a Japanese captain, who spoke a little Dutch. He came up to me, and after several questions, which I answered in great humility, he said we should not die. The other ship was commanded by a Dutchman, who knew by our countenance that we were Englishmen, and swore we should be tied back to back and thrown into the sea. I turned to the Dutchman and said I was sorry to find more mercy in a heathen than in a brother Christian. But I soon had reason to repent those foolish words, for that malicious reprobate persuaded the Japanese captain to split my men in an equal division into both of the pirate ships. It was decided that I be set adrift in a small canoe, with paddles and a sail and 4 days' provision. When I was at some distance from the pirates, I discovered by my pocket glass several islands to the southeast. But not to trouble the listener with a particular account of my distresses, let it suffice that on the 5th day I arrived at the last island in my sight. I found it to be all rocky, only a little intermingled with tufts of grass and sweet-smelling herbs. I secured my provisions in a cave. I lay all night there, sleeping very little, for the disquiets of my mind prevailed over my weariness and kept me awake. I considered how impossible it was to preserve my life in so desolate a place, and how miserable my end must be. In the morning I walked a while among the rocks. The sky was perfectly clear, and the sun was so hot that I was forced to turn my face from it, when all of a sudden it became obscured. I perceived a vast, opaque body between me and the sun, moving forwards toward the island. It appeared to be a firm substance, the bottom flat and smooth, and shining very bright from the reflection of the sea below. I stood upon a height about 200 yards from the shore, and saw this vast body descending almost to a parallel with me. I took out my pocket perspective, and could plainly discover numbers of people moving up and down the sides of it, which appeared to be sloping, but what those people were doing I was not able to distinguish. The natural love of life gave me some inward motions of joy, and I was ready to entertain a hope that this adventure might, some way or other, help to deliver me from the desolate place and condition I was in. But at the same time, the listener can hardly conceive my astonishment to behold an island in the air, inhabited by men who were able to raise or sink, or put it into a progressive motion as they pleased. Soon after, it advanced nearer, and I could see the sides of it, encompassed with several gradations of galleries, and stairs at certain intervals to descend from one to the other. In the lowest gallery, I beheld some people fishing with long angling rods, and others looking on. I waved my cap and my handkerchief towards the island, and upon its nearer approach, I called and shouted with the utmost strength of my voice. I beheld a crowd gather to that side which was most in my view. I found by their pointing towards me, and to each other, that they plainly discovered me, although they made no return to my shouting. They made signs for me to come down from the rock and go towards the shore, which I accordingly did. And the flying island being raised to a convenient height, a chain was let down from the lowest gallery, with a seat fastened to the bottom, to which I fixed myself, and was drawn up by pulleys. At my alighting, I was surrounded by a crowd of people who beheld me with all the marks and circumstances of wonder. I had never till then seen a race of mortals so singular in their shapes, habits, and countenances. Their heads were all reclined either to the right or the left, one of their eyes turned inward, and the other directly up to the zenith. Their outward garments were adorned with figures of suns, moons, and stars, interwoven with those of fiddles, flutes, harps, trumpets, guitars, harpsichords, and many other instruments of music. I was conducted up the stairs to the top of the island, and from thence to the royal palace. In the chamber of presence, the king was seated on his throne, attended on each side by persons of prime quality. Before the throne was a large table filled with globes and spheres, and mathematical instruments of all kinds. His Majesty took not the least notice of us. He was then deep in a problem, and we attended at least an hour before he could solve it. Looking towards me, in the company I was in, he obviously recollected the occasion of our coming, whereof he had been informed before. The king, as far as I could conjecture, asked me several questions, and I addressed myself to him in all the languages I had, when it was found that I could neither understand nor be understood. I was conducted by the king's order to an apartment in his palace, where 2 servants were appointed to attend me and bring me dinner. I had 2 courses of 3 dishes each. The servants had cut up all the food into mathematical shapes, cones, cylinders, parallelograms, and musical shapes, fiddles, flutes, harps. After dinner, a person was sent to me by the king's order. He brought with him pen, ink, and paper, and 3 or 4 books, giving me to understand by signs that he was sent to teach me the language. He showed me also in one of his books the figures of the sun, moon, and stars, the zodiac, the tropics, and polar circles, together with the denominations of many figures of planes and solids. He gave me the names and descriptions of all the musical instruments, and the general terms of art and playing on each of them. Those to whom the king had entrusted me, observing how ill I was clad, ordered a tailor to come next morning and take my measure for a suit of clothes. This operator did his office after a different manner from those of his trade in Europe. He first took my altitude by a quadrant, and then with a rule and compasses described the dimensions and outlines of my whole body, all of which he entered upon paper, and in 6 days brought my clothes very ill made and quite out of shape, by happening to mistake a figure in the calculation. But my comfort was that I observed such accidents very frequent and little regarded. During my confinement for want of clothes, I much enlarged my dictionary, and when I went next to court, was able to understand many things the king spoke, and to return him some kind of answers. His Majesty had given orders that the island should move northeast by east to the vertical point over Legado, the metropolis of the whole kingdom of Balnibarbi, below upon the firm earth. It was about 90 leagues distant, and our voyage lasted 4 days and a half. I was not in the least sensible to the progressive motion made in the air by the island. On the 2nd morning, about 11 o'clock, the king himself in person, attended by his nobility, courtiers, and officers, having prepared all their musical instruments, played on them for 3 hours without intermission, so that I was quite stunned with the noise. Neither could I possibly guess the meaning till my tutor informed me. He said that the people of their island had their ears adapted to hear the music of the spheres, which always played at certain periods, and the court was now prepared to bear their part in whatever instrument they most excelled. The knowledge I had in mathematics gave me great assistance in acquiring their phraseology, which depended much upon that science, and music. Their ideas are perpetually conversant in lines and figures. If they would, for example, praise the beauty of a woman, they describe it by rhombs, circles, parallelograms, ellipses, and other geometrical terms, or by words of art drawn from music. Their houses are very ill built, without one right angle in any apartment, and this defect ariseth from the contempt they bear to practical geometry, which they despise as vulgar and mechanic, those instructions they give being too refined for the intellectuals of their workmen, which occasions perpetual mistakes. And although they are dexterous enough upon a piece of paper in the management of the rule, the pencil, and the divider, yet in the common actions and behavior of life, I have not seen a more clumsy, awkward, and unhandy people, nor so slow and perplexed in their conceptions upon all other subjects, except those of mathematics and music. They are very bad reasoners, and vehemently given to opposition, unless when they happen to be of the right opinion, which is seldom their case. Imagination, fancy, and invention they're wholly strangers to, nor have any words in their language by which those ideas can be expressed. The whole compass of their thoughts and mind been shut up within the two forementioned sciences. These people are under continual disquietudes, never enjoying a minute's peace of mind, and their disturbances proceed from causes which very little affect the rest of mortals. Their apprehensions arise from several changes they dread in the celestial bodies. For instance, that the earth, by the continual approaches of the sun towards it, must, in course of time, be absorbed or swallowed up. They are so perpetually alarmed with the apprehensions of these and the like impending dangers, that they can neither sleep quietly in their beds, nor have any relish for the common pleasures or amusements of life. When they meet an acquaintance in the morning, the first question is about the sun's health, how he looked at his setting and rising, and what hopes they have to avoid the stroke of the approaching comet. The women of the island have abundance of vivacity. They condemn their husbands as being too wrapped in speculation to pay proper attention to them, and thus they are exceedingly fond of strangers, whereof there is always a considerable number from the continent below attending at court. Among these the ladies choose their dalliances, and the mistress and lover may safely proceed to the greatest familiarities right before the unseeing face of the husband. I desired leave of the king to see the curiosities of the island, which he was graciously pleased to grant, and ordered my tutor to attend me. I chiefly wanted to know what cause in art or nature it owed its several motions. The flying or floating island is exactly circular, its diameter about 4 miles and a half, and consequently contains 10,000 acres. It is 300 yards thick. The bottom, or undersurface, is one even regular plate of adamant, shooting up to the height of about 200 yards. A magnet, or lodestone, moves it up and down, depending upon whether the positive or negative pole is pointed at Balnivarbi. The island moves forward and backward by oblique attraction. These people spend the greatest part of their lives in observing the celestial bodies, which they do by the assistance of glasses far excelling ours in goodness. This advantage hath enabled them to extend their discoveries much further than our astronomers in Europe, for they have made a catalogue of 10,000 fixed stars, whereas the largest of ours do not contain above 1/3 part of that number. They have likewise discovered 2 lesser stars, or satellites, which revolve around Mars, and they have observed 93 different comets, and settled their periods with great exactness. The king would be the most absolute prince in the universe if he could but prevail on a ministry to join with him. But these, having their estates below on the continent, and considering that the office of a favorite hath a very uncertain tenure, would never consent to the enslaving of their country. If any town should engage in rebellion or mutiny, fall into violent factions, or refuse to pay the usual tribute, the king hath 2 methods of reducing them to obedience. The first and the mildest course is by keeping the island hovering over such a town, and the lands about it, whereby he can deprive them of the benefit of the sun and the rain, and consequently afflict the inhabitants with death and diseases. And if the crime deserve it, they are at the same time pelted from above with great stones, against which they have no defense but by creeping into cellars or caves, while the roofs of their houses are beaten to pieces. But if they still continue obstinate, or offer to raise insurrections, he proceeds to the last remedy, by letting the island drop directly upon their heads, which makes a universal destruction both of houses and men. However, this is an extremity to which the king is seldom driven, for if the town intended to be destroyed should have in it any tall rocks, pillars of stone, or spires, it might break up the bottom of Laputa. Although I cannot say that I was ill-treated in this island, after having seen all its curiosities, I was very desirous to leave it, being heartily weary of these people. There was a great lord at court, nearly related to the king, and for that reason alone used with respect. I entreated this illustrious person to intercede in my behalf with his majesty for leave to depart, which he accordingly did, as he was pleased to tell me, with regret. For indeed he made me several offers very advantageous, which however I refused with expressions of the highest acknowledgment. On the 16th day of February, I took leave of his majesty in the court with the intention to explore the continent below us, which, as far as it is subject to the monarch of the flying island, passed under the general name of Balnabarbi, and whose metropolis, as I said before, is called Legado. The king made me a present to the value of about £200 English, together with a letter of recommendation to a friend of his in Legado. The island being hovering over a mountain about 2 miles from it, I was let down from the lowest gallery in the same manner as I'd been taken up. Menotti, my host in Balnabarbi, treated me well. He showed me around the island, and a most unusual island it proved to be. Except for his estate, which was flourishing and green, the land was completely eroded and barren. The houses were very strangely built, and most of them out of repair. The people in the streets walked fast, looked wild, their eyes fixed, and were generally in rags. I questioned him about this contrast, and was told that about 40 years before, a group of Balnabarbian inventors and promoters visited Laputa. They returned with theoretical schemes for improving the island, but the plans never worked. I never knew a soil so unhappily cultivated, houses so ill-contrived and so ruinous, or a people whose countenances and habit expressed so much misery and want. My next visit was to the Balnabarbian Grand Academy, where many projects and experiments were being carried on. The first man I watched was of a meager aspect, with sooty hands and face, his hair and beard long, ragged and singed in several places. He had been 8 years upon a project for extracting sunbeams out of cucumbers. Another fellow was trying to reduce human excrement to its original food origin. I saw another at work to calcine ice into gunpowder. There was a most ingenious architect who had contrived a new method for building houses by beginning at the roof and working downwards to the foundation. In one section of the academy, a man explained to me his new crops planting process. Fields were plowed by bearing food and then letting hogs root for it. I was also introduced to various political scientists who appeared, in my judgment, to be wholly out of their senses. These unhappy people were proposing schemes for persuading monarchs to choose favorites upon the score of their wisdom, capacity, and virtue, of teaching ministers to consult the public good, of instructing princes to know their true interest by placing it on the same foundation with that of their people, of choosing for employments persons qualified to exercise them, with many other wild, impossible chimeras that never entered before into the heart of man to conceive. This served to confirm in me the old observation that there is nothing so extravagant and irrational which some philosophers have not maintained for truth. But however, I shall so far do justice to this part of the academy as to acknowledge that all of them were not so visionary. There was a most ingenious doctor who proposed that he would cure the ills of the state by curing the loathsome diseases of the legislators. Upon the meeting of a senate, certain physicians should attend at the first 3 days of their sitting, and at the close of each day's debate feel the pulses of every senator, after which, having maturely considered and consulted upon the nature of the several maladies and the methods of cure, they should on the 4th day return to the Senate House, attended by their apothecaries stored with the proper medicines, and before the members sat, administer to each of them lenitives, aperitices, abscessives, corrosives, restringents, palliatives, laxatives, cephalalgics, icterics, apophlegmatics, acoustics, as their several cases required. And according as these medicines should operate, repeat, alter, or omit them at the next meeting. This same doctor proposed that every senator in the great council of a nation, after he had delivered his opinion and argued in the defense of it, should be obliged to give his vote directly contrary, because if that were done, the result would infallibly terminate in the good of the public. One of the professors said that he would expose treasonous government plots by examining excrement, since men are most thoughtful on the toilet. I met many other scientists and professors, but shall not trouble my listener with all the curiosities I observed, being studious of brevity. I saw nothing in this country that could invite me to a longer continuance, and began to think of returning home to England. I left Balnibarbi and prepared to sail for the island of Lugnag, which stands southeastwards of Japan about 100 leagues distant. I hired 2 mules with a guide to show me the way to the port of Maldonado. My journey was without incident or any adventure worth relating, but when I reached Maldonado, I learned that there were no ships bound for Lugnag for another month. But I did not despair. My curiosity was stronger than my disappointment. Therefore I decided to visit Glubbdubdrib, a little island about 5 miles to the southwest. Glubbdubdrib is about one-third as large as the Isle of Wight, and extremely fruitful. It is governed by the head of a certain tribe, who are all magicians. This tribe marries only among each other, and the eldest in succession is prince or governor. He hath a noble palace and a park of about 3,000 acres, surrounded by a wall of hewn stone 20 foot high. The governor and his family are served and attended by domestics of a kind somewhat unusual. By his skill in necromancy, he hath a power of calling whom he pleaseth from the dead, and commanding their service for 24 hours, but no longer. Nor can he call the same persons up again in less than 3 months, except upon very extraordinary occasions. The governor was friendly to me, and agreed to call up some of the illustrious dead for me to question. My first inclination was to be entertained with scenes of pomp and magnificence, so I told the governor I desired to see Alexander the Great at the head of his army just after the battle of Arbela, which, upon a motion of the governor's finger, immediately appeared in a large field under the window where we stood. Alexander was called up into the room. It was with great difficulty that I understood his Greek, and had but little of my own. He assured me upon his honor that he was not poisoned, but died of a fever by excessive drinking. Next, I saw Hannibal passing the Alps, who told me he had not a drop of vinegar in his camp. I saw Caesar and Brutus. Caesar confessed that all his glory didn't equal the glory Brutus gained by murdering him. It would be tedious to trouble the listener with relating what vast numbers of illustrious persons were called up. In the end, I concluded that history is not at all what it seems. The day of our departure being come, I took leave of His Highness the Governor of Glubbdubdrib, and returned with my 2 companions to Maldonado, where after a fortnight's waiting, a ship was ready to sail for Lugnag. The 2 gentlemen were so generous and kind as to furnish me with provisions. I sailed to Lugnag, posing as a Dutchman, but was discovered and imprisoned. The king sent for me 2 days after my arrival, and I was astounded to discover that he required those who had an audience with him to crawl on their belly, advance on their hands and knees, and lick the floor. When a courtier was out of favor, he sprinkled poison on the floor. Sometimes after this ritual, the pages forgot or carelessly neglected to sweep the floor, and in many cases such carelessness was fatal. The king was much delighted with my company, and ordered his high chamberlain to appoint a lodging for me in the court, with a daily allowance for my table and a large purse of gold for my common expenses. I stayed 3 months in this country, out of perfect obedience to His Majesty, who was pleased highly to favor me, and made me very honorable offers. But I thought it more consistent with prudence and justice to pass the remainder of my days with my wife and family. His Majesty was pleased to give me license to depart, and honored me with a letter of recommendation under his own hand to the Emperor of Japan. He likewise presented me with 444 large pieces of gold, this nation delighting in even numbers, and a red diamond which I sold in England for 1,100 pounds. On the 6th day of May, 1709, I took a solemn leave of His Majesty and all my friends. In 6 days I found a vessel ready to carry me to Japan, and spent 15 days in the voyage. When I arrived at Nangasak, I soon fell into company of some Dutch sailors belonging to the Amboina, a Dutch ship returning to Amsterdam. Nothing happened worth mentioning in this voyage. On the 10th of April, we arrived safe at Amsterdam. From Amsterdam I soon after set sail for England in a small vessel. On the 11th day of April, 1710, we put in at the Downs. I went straight to Redriff, where I found my wife and family in good health. Part 4. A Voyage to the Country of the Houyhnhnms. I continued at home with my wife and children about 5 months, in a very happy condition, until I once again listened to the call of the sea. This time I left my poor wife, big with child, and accepted an advantageous offer made me to be captain of the Adventure, a stout merchantman of 350 tons. We set sail from Portsmouth upon the 7th day of August, 1710. Trouble began to plague our voyage from the very beginning, when an epidemic of fever struck us. Several men were lost, and I had to get recruits in the Barbados. The new sailors, however, turned out to be buccaneers. They mutinied, held me prisoner, and marooned me on a strange land. I wandered inland and discovered many kinds of tracks, human, horse, and cow. At last I beheld several animals in a field, and one or two of the same kind sitting in trees. Their shape was very singular and deformed, which a little discomposed me, so that I lay down behind a thicket to observe them better. Their heads and breasts were covered with a thick hair, some frizzled and others lank. They had beards like goats, and a long ridge of hair down their backs, and the fore parts of their legs and feet. But the rest of their bodies were bare, so that I might see their skins, which were of a brown-buff color. They had no tails, nor hair at all on their buttocks. They often stood on their hind feet and proceeded to climb high trees as nimbly as a squirrel, for they had strong, extended claws before and behind, terminating in sharp points and hooked. The females were not so large as the males. They had long, lank hair on their heads, but none on their faces. Upon the whole, I never beheld in all my travels so disagreeable an animal, nor one against which I naturally conceived so strong an antipathy. So I got up and pursued the beaten road, hoping it might direct me to the cabin of some Indian. I had not got far when I met one of these creatures full in my way, and coming up directly to me. The ugly monster distorted several ways every feature of his visage, and stared at me as at an object he had never seen before. Then, approaching near, lifted up his forepaw, either out of curiosity or mischief, I could not tell. But I drew my hanger, and gave him a good blow with the flat side of it. When the beast felt the smart, he drew back, and roared so loud that a herd of at least 40 came flocking about me from the next field, howling and making odious faces. But I ran to the body of a tree, and leaning my back against it, kept them off by waving my hanger. Several of this cursed brood, getting hold of the branches behind, leapt up into the tree, from whence they began to discharge their excrements on my head. However, I escaped pretty well by sticking close to the stem of the tree, but was almost stifled with the filth, which fell about me on every side. In the midst of this distress, I observed them all to run away on a sudden, as fast as they could, at which I ventured to pursue the road, wondering what it was that could put them into this fright. But looking on my left hand, I saw a horse walking softly in the field, which my persecutors, having sooner discovered, was the cause of their flight. The horse looked at me in wonder, and whinnied to another horse. I watched as the two horses conversed in their whinnying language. They came up close to me, looking with great earnestness upon my face and hands. They were under great perplexity about my clothing, and felt of it very often, neighing to each other and using various gestures. Upon the whole, the behavior of these animals was so orderly and rational, so acute and judicious, that I at last concluded they must be magicians, who had thus metamorphosed themselves upon some design, and seeing a stranger in the way, were resolved to divert themselves with him. Or perhaps were really amazed at the sight of a man so very different in habit, feature, and complexion from those who might probably live in so remote a climate. Upon the strength of this reasoning, I tried to talk to them, but discerned only 2 words, Yahoo and Houyhnhnm. After some further discourse, the 2 took their leaves. One was colored dapple gray, and it was he who made me signs that I should walk before him, wherein I thought it prudent to comply till I could find a better director. Having traveled about 3 miles, we came to a long kind of building, made of timber stuck in the ground. The roof was low and covered with straw. The horse made me a sign to go in first. It was a large room with a smooth clay floor, and a rack and manger extending the whole length on one side. There were 3 nags and 2 mares, not eating, but some of them sitting down on their hams, which I very much wondered at, but wondered more to see the rest employed in domestic business. These seemed but ordinary cattle. However, this confirmed my first opinion, that a people who could so far civilize brute animals must needs excel in wisdom all the nations of the world. The gray came in just after, and thereby prevented any ill treatment which the others might have given me. He neighed to them several times in a style of authority, and received answers. Beyond this room there were 3 others, reaching the length of the house. We went through the second room towards the third. Here the gray walked in first, beckoning me to attend. I waited in the second room. The horse neighed 3 or 4 times, and I waited to hear some answers in a human voice, but I heard no other returns than in the same dialect, only 1 or 2 a little shriller than his. I began to think that this house must belong to some person of great note among them, because there appeared so much ceremony before I could gain admittance. But that a man of quality should be served all by horses was beyond my comprehension. I feared my brain was disturbed by my sufferings and misfortunes. I pinched my arms and sides to awake myself, hoping I might be in a dream. The gray horse came to the door, and made me a sign to follow him into the third room, where I saw a very comely mare, together with a colt and foal, sitting on their haunches upon mats of straw, not unartfully made, and perfectly neat and clean. But in contrast I was taken outside and shown a filthy building, where there were 3 of the detestable tailless monkeys. They were feeding upon roots and the flesh of some animals. They were all tied by the neck with strong wires fastened to a beam. The master horse ordered a sorrel nag, one of his servants, to untie the largest of these animals and take him into the yard. The beast and I were brought close together, and our countenances diligently compared, both my master and servant, who thereupon repeated several times the word Yahoo. My horror and astonishment are not to be described when I observed in this abominable animal a perfect human figure. The great difficulty that seemed to stick with the 2 horses was to see the rest of my body so very different from that of a Yahoo, for which I was obliged to my clothes, whereof they had no conception. I was terrified that I was going to be kept with these loathsome Yahoos, but the Houyhnhnms put me in a separate place. Meals were hardest to bear. I could not eat hay, and refused to eat the rotten meat that the Yahoos lived on. The horses dined on oats boiled in milk, and I discovered how to make a nourishing, if not completely palatable, paste of oats and milk. I sometimes made a shift to catch a rabbit or bird by springes made of Yahoo's hairs, and I often gathered wholesome herbs, which I boiled or ate as salads. Now and then, for a rarity, I made a little butter. This is enough to say upon the subject of my diet. However, it was necessary to mention the matter, lest the world should think it impossible that I could find sustenance for 3 years in such a country and among such inhabitants. Given how adept I was at languages, I learned rather quickly to talk with the Houyhnhnms. My master, for so I shall henceforth call him, and his children and every servant of his house were desirous to teach me. In speaking, they pronounce through the nose and throat, and their language approaches nearest to the High Dutch or German of any I know in Europe, but is much more graceful. My master was convinced that I must be a Yahoo, but my teachableness, civility, and cleanliness astonished him, which were qualities altogether so opposite to these animals. My master was eager to learn from whence I came, how I acquired those appearances of reason which I discovered in all my actions, and to know my story from my own mouth. In about 10 weeks' time, I was able to understand most of his questions, and in 3 months could give him some tolerable answers. I made so great a progress that in 5 months from my arrival I understood whatever was spoke, and could express myself tolerably well. I soon learned the meaning of Houyhnhnm. Besides meaning horse, The word is derived from a word meaning perfection of nature. The Winhams who came to visit my master out of design of seeing and talking with me could hardly believe me to be a right Yahoo, because my body had a different covering from others of my kind. They were astonished to observe me without the usual hair or skin, except on my head, face, and hands. I had hitherto concealed the secret of my dress in order to distinguish myself as much as possible from that cursed race of Yahoos. But my clothes and shoes would wear out soon, and would have to be supplied by some contrivance from the hides of Yahoos or other brutes, whereby the whole secret would be known. I therefore told my master that in the country from whence I came, those of my kind always covered their bodies with the hairs of certain animals prepared by art, as well for decency as to avoid the inclemencies of air, both hot and cold. I unbuttoned my coat and pulled it off. I did the same with my waistcoat. I drew off my shoes, stockings, and breeches. I let my shirt down to my waist, and drew up the bottom, fastening it like a girdle about my middle to hide my nakedness. My master observed the whole performance with great signs of curiosity and admiration. He took up all my clothes in his pastern, one piece after another, and examined them diligently. He then stroked my body very gently, and looked round me several times, after which he said it was plain I must be a perfect Yahoo, but that I differed very much from the rest of my species in the softness and whiteness and smoothness of my skin. I expressed my uneasiness at his giving me so often the appellation of Yahoo, an odious animal for which I had so utter a hatred and contempt. I begged he would forbear applying that word to me, and take the same order in his family and among his friends. I requested likewise that the secret of my having a false covering to my body be known to none but himself, at least as long as my present clothing should last. All this my master very graciously consented to. In frequent discourses with my master concerning the nature of manhood in other parts of the world, we had occasion to talk of lying and false representation. It was with much difficulty that he comprehended what I meant, although he had otherwise a most acute judgment. For he argued thus, that the use of speech was to make us understand one another, and to receive information of facts. Now if anyone said the thing which was not, these ends were defeated. To return from this digression, when I asserted that the Yahoos were the only governing animals in my country, which my master said was altogether past his conception, he desired to know whether we had Houyhnhnms among us in England, and how we treated them. I went on to explain how horses are often castrated, how we ride on them and have them pull our carriages, and that no one in England would ever consider horses their masters. It is impossible to represent his noble resentment at our savage treatment of the Houyhnhnm race. He said if it were possible there could be any country where Yahoos alone were imbued with reason, they certainly must be the governing animal, because reason will in time always prevail against brutal strength. But considering the frame of our bodies, and especially of mine, he thought no creature of equal bulk was so ill contrived for employing that reason in the common offices of life. Whereupon he desired to know whether those among whom I lived resembled me or the Yahoos of his country. I assured him that I was as well shaped as most of my age, but the younger and the females were much more soft and tender, and the skins of the latter generally as white as milk. He said I differed indeed from other Yahoos, being much more cleanly, and not altogether so deformed, but in point of real advantage he thought I differed for the worse, that my nails were of no use either to my fore or hinder feet, that I could not walk with any security, for if either of my hinder feet slipped, I must inevitably fall. He then began to find fault with other parts of my body, the flatness of my face, the prominence of my nose, the eyes placed directly in front so that I could not look on either side without turning my head, that I was not able to feed myself without lifting up one of my forefeet to my mouth, and therefore nature had placed those joints to answer that necessity. And lastly,
that he observed every animal in this country naturally to abhor the Yahoos, whom the weaker avoided and the stronger drove from them. So that supposing us to have the gift of reason, he could not see how it were possible to cure that natural antipathy which every creature discovered against us, nor, consequently, how we could tame and render them serviceable. However, he would, as he said, debate the matter no farther, because he was more desirous to know my own story, the country where I was born, and the several actions and events of my life before I came hither. I gave him an account of my life and my adventures at sea. When it came to describing my crew members, I related that they were fellows of desperate fortunes, forced to fly from the places of their birth on account of their poverty or their crimes. Some were undone by lawsuits, drinking, whoring, gaming. Others fled for treason, murder, theft, poisoning, robbery, perjury, forgery, coining false money, for committing rapes or sodomy. I found that I had to explain what the nature of these crimes were. Words such as power, government, war, law, and punishment had no equivalents in the language of the Houyhnhnms. In our many conversations, I laid before my master, as well as I could, the whole state of Europe, discoursing on the trade and manufacturing, arts and sciences, governments, religions, and wars. The Europeans, I told him, in the name of religious belief, will kill over whether flesh is bread or whether blood is wine. Likewise, they murder each other out of jealousy for a government post. No wars are so passionate, long, and bloody as those fought over insignificant matters. An invading prince, I said, will conquer a country, kill half the population, and make slaves of the rest. He will do this in the holy name of civilization. His motive will be to reduce them from their barbarous ways of living. I truly shocked my master when I revealed that the most honored European is the Yahoo whose job it is to kill as many of his own species as he can. None of these men have offended him, yet his job is to kill. My master commented that although his Yahoos are abominable, English Yahoos are far worse. They use their reason to magnify, yet excuse their vices. I then turned to the subject of law. My master was at a loss how it should come to pass that the law, which was intended for every man's preservation, should be any man's ruin, as in the case of my crew members. I told him about the courts, judges, and lawyers, and my belief that lawyers were the most ignorant, stupid, and despicable men amongst us, avowed enemies to all knowledge and learning, and equally disposed to pervert the general reason of mankind in every other subject of discourse as in that of their own profession. My master was yet wholly at a loss to understand what motives could incite this race of lawyers to engage in a confederacy of injustice merely for the sake of injuring their fellow animals. Neither could he comprehend what I meant in saying they did it for hire. Whereupon I was at much pains to describe to him the use of money, the materials it was made of, and the value of the metals. That when a Yahoo had got a great store of this precious substance, he was able to purchase whatever he had a mind to, the finest clothing, the noblest houses, great tracts of land, the most costly meats and drinks, and have his choice of the most beautiful females. Commerce, I told him, forces men to earn a living by begging, robbing, stealing, cheating, pimping, forswearing, flattering, forging, lying, fawning, scribbling, poisoning, whoring, libeling, free-thinking, and the like. Men lust for luxury, but once they have it, it breeds sicknesses. And who treats the sick? Doctors, who can magically predict death because they can always kill their patients. Doctors, I lamented, seldom cure. The listener may be disposed to wonder how I could prevail on myself to give so free a representation of my own species, among a race of mortals who were already too apt to conceive the vilest opinion of humankind, from that entire congruity betwixt me and their Yahoos. But I must freely confess that the many virtues of those excellent quadrupeds, placed in opposite view to human corruptions, had so far opened my eyes and enlarged my understanding that I began to view the actions and passions of man in a very different light. I had not been a year in this country before I contracted such a love and veneration for the inhabitants that I entered on a firm resolution never to return to humankind, but to pass the rest of my life among these admirable Houyhnhnms in the contemplation and practice of every virtue, where I could have no example or incitement to vice. But it was decreed by fortune, my perpetual enemy, that so great a facility should not fall to my share. I came to understand that the more I talked to my master, the more thoroughly I convinced him that there are genetic and psychological links between humans and Yahoos. I do not like even to consider such an idea. Yahoos are greedy, treacherous, and callous. They're dirty and lewd. They eat anything and everything and are subject to disease. For their leaders, they choose the most vicious specimens. In contrast to the Yahoos, the Houyhnhnms govern themselves wholly by reason. There are no disputes or confusion among them, because they are reasonable and truthful. Once every 4 years, the Houyhnhnms meet at an assembly to settle problems. I was not at all surprised to learn that there are few or no problems that ever need solving. One of these grand assemblies was held in my time, about 3 months before my departure, whither my master went as the representative of our district. In this council was resumed their old debate, and indeed the only debate which ever happened in that country, whether the Yahoos should be exterminated from the face of the earth. None of the Houyhnhnms liked the Yahoos, yet they had been allowed to increase in population because they were used as beasts of burden. I was amused to hear my master tell me that he had advanced an argument at the assembly that he had borrowed from me. If Yahoos in England castrate Houyhnhnms, why couldn't the Houyhnhnms castrate the Yahoos? I have hitherto neglected to mention several attributes of the Houyhnhnms, and furnish further details as to why they are such a reasonable and healthy race. They have no letters, and consequently their knowledge is all traditional. But there happening few events of any moment among a people so well united, naturally disposed to every virtue, wholly governed by reason, and cut off from all commerce with other nations, the historical part is easily preserved without burthening their memories. They are subject to no diseases, and therefore have no need of physicians. However, they have excellent medicines composed of herbs to cure accidental bruises and cuts. They calculate the year by the revolution of the sun and the moon, but use no subdivisions into weeks. In poetry they must be allowed to excel all other mortals. Their verses abound very much in the justness of their similes, and the minuteness as well as the exactness of their descriptions. Their buildings, although very crude and simple, are well contrived to defend them from all injuries of cold and heat. If they can avoid casualties, they die only of old age and are buried in the obscurest places that can be found. Their friends and relations express neither joy nor grief at their departure, nor does the dying person discover the least regret that he is leaving the world, any more than if he were upon returning home from a visit to one of his neighbors. They live generally to 70 or 75 years, very seldom to 80. Some weeks before their death, they feel a gradual decay, but without pain. The Houyhnhnms have no word in their language to express anything that is evil, except what they borrow from the deformities or ill qualities of the Yahoos. I had settled my little economy to my own heart's content. My master had ordered a room to be made for me after their manner. When my clothes were worn to rags, I made myself others with the skins of rabbit. I soled my shoes with wood which I cut from a tree, and fitted to the upper leather, and when this was worn out, I supplied it with the skins of Yahoos, dried in the sun. I often got honey out of hollow trees, which I mingled with water or ate with my bread. No man could more verify the truth of these two maxims, that nature is very easily satisfied, and that necessity is the mother of invention. I enjoyed perfect health of body and tranquillity of mind. I did not feel the treachery or inconstancy of a friend, nor the injuries of a secret or open enemy. I had no occasion of bribing, flattering, or pimping to procure the favor of any great man or of his minion. I wanted no fence against fraud or oppression. Here was neither physician to destroy my body, nor lawyer to ruin my fortune. No informer to watch my words and actions, or forge accusations against me for hire. Here were no gibers, censurers, backbiters, pickpockets, highwaymen, housebreakers, attorneys, bawds, buffoons, gamesters, politicians, wits, splenetics, tedious talkers, controversists, ravishers, murderers, robbers, virtuosos. No leaders or followers of party and faction, no encouragers to vice by seducement or example, no dungeons, axes, gibbets, whipping posts or pillories, no cheating shopkeepers or mechanics, no pride, vanity, or affection, no fops, bullies, drunkards, strolling whores, or poxes. No ranting, lewd, expensive wives, no stupid, proud pedants, no importunate, overbearing, quarrelsome, noisy, roaring, empty, conceited, swearing companions, no scoundrels raised from the dust for the sake of their vices, or nobility thrown into it on account of their virtues, no lords, fiddlers, judges, or dancing masters. When I thought of my family, my friends, my countrymen, or human race in general, I considered them as they really were, yahoos in shape and disposition, perhaps a little more civilized and qualified with the gift of speech, but making no other use of reason than to improve and multiply those vices whereof their brethren in this country had only the share that nature allotted them. When I happened to behold the reflection of my own form in a lake or fountain, I turned away my face in horror and detestation of myself, and could better endure the sight of a common yahoo than of my own person. By conversing with the Houyhnhnms and looking upon them with delight, I fell to imitate their gait and gesture, which is now grown into a habit, and my friends often tell me in a blunt way that I trot like a horse, which, however, I take for a great compliment. Neither shall I disown that in speaking I am apt to fall into the voice and manner of the Houyhnhnms, and hear myself ridiculed on that account without the least mortification. In the midst of all this happiness, and when I looked upon myself to be fully settled for life, my master sent for me one morning. He told me he did not know how I would take what he was going to say. That in the last General Assembly, when the affair of the yahoos was entered upon, the representatives had taken offense at his keeping a yahoo, meaning myself, in his family more like a Houyhnhnm than a brute animal. The assembly reasoned that I am a yahoo, despite my clothes, my ability to converse, and any other niceties I might possess, and that they feared me to organize the other yahoos and lead a revolt. They advised my master to either treat his strange pet yahoo like a yahoo, or command him to swim back to his native land. I was struck with the utmost grief and despair. I would have preferred death. But I finally resolved to construct a vessel and sail to an island that was visible about 5 leagues from the Houyhnhnm coast. When all was ready, and the day came for my departure, I took leave of my master and the whole family, my eyes glowing with tears, and my heart quite sunk with grief. But his honor, out of curiosity and partly out of kindness, was determined to see me in my canoe, and got several of his friends to accompany him. As I was about to get in the boat, I kneeled down to prostrate myself to kiss my master's hoof. He did me the honor to raise it gently to my mouth. I paid my respects to the rest of the Houyhnhnms in his honor's company. Then, getting into my canoe, I pushed off from shore. For the sake of brevity, I shall omit for my listeners the details of my journey back to England, other than to say that I made it to the offshore island I had spotted, and eventually found passage in Portugal on a boat bound for London. We cast anchor in the Downs about 9 in the morning on the 5th of December, 1715. At 3 in the afternoon, I got safe to my house at Rotherhithe. My wife and family received me with great surprise and joy, because they concluded me certainly dead. But I must freely confess the sight of them filled me only with hatred, disgust, and contempt, and the more by reflecting on the near alliance I had to them. I could not bear the sight and smell of my Yahoo-like wife. When I began to consider that by copulating with one of the Yahoo species, I had become a parent of more, it struck me with the utmost shame, confusion, and horror. 5 years have now passed since my return to England. During the first year, I could not endure my wife or children in my presence. The very smell of them was intolerable. Much less could I suffer them to eat in the same room. The first money I laid out was to buy 2 young stone horses, which I keep in a good stable, and next to them, the groom is my greatest favorite, for I feel my spirits revived by the smell he contracts in the stable. My horses understand me tolerably well. I converse with them at least 4 hours each day. They are strangers to bridle or saddle. They live in great amity with me, and friendship to each other.
Gulliver's Travels was written by Jonathan Swift and read by Ted Danson. It was abridged for audio by Harold Schmidt. The publisher's note was read by Bill Ratner. The recording engineer was Mike Hanley at Mark Grau Recording, Burbank, California. Digital editing and post-production by Colin Sean Mahoney. The associate producer was Florence Burrow Adams. Gulliver's Travels was produced and directed by Linda Woolman. This has been a presentation of Simon & Schuster Audio.